Picture this, a small band of humans, wrapped in animal hides, standing at the edge of a world they've never seen before. Behind them, the familiar landscapes of home. Ahead, vast unknown territories stretching farther than any eye could see. They take that first step, not just across a physical boundary, but into a future that would eventually shape every one of us. This moment, repeated again and again across tens of thousands of years, is part of a story written in our very bones. It's the story of ancient migration, and it's one of the most powerful and overlooked forces in human history. We often think of continents as fixed, permanent divisions: Africa, Asia, Europe, the Americas, but for our ancestors, they weren't barriers. They were bridges, they were invitations. Long before roads, maps, or nations existed, humans moved. They followed rivers, coastlines, and animal herds. They crossed frozen land bridges and sailed uncharted oceans, and with every journey they carried something priceless: their knowledge, their languages, their beliefs, and their DNA. These ancient migration patterns didn't just populate the planet, they built the world as we know it. From the languages we speak to the foods we eat, from the stories we tell to the genetic traits we inherit, the echoes of these epic journeys are still with us today. In this video, we're going to trace those echoes. We'll explore how early humans moved out of Africa and spread across the globe, how they met other hominin species like the Neanderthals, and how they eventually reached the farthest corners of the Earth, from the icy plains of Siberia to the lush islands of the Pacific. We'll uncover how migrations sparked the exchange of ideas and technologies, how they shaped empires and economies, and how they influenced everything from religion to cuisine. This isn't just a story about the past. It's about understanding the deep, invisible threads that connect all of humanity. So settle in. We're about to embark on a journey through time, retracing the steps of our ancestors and discovering how their courage, curiosity, and resilience continue to define us today. 60,000 years ago, the world was a vastly different place. Ice sheets locked away enormous amounts of water, exposing land bridges that are now submerged beneath the seas. It was during this epoch of dramatic change that a small population of Homo sapiens in Africa began a journey that would irrevocably alter the course of history. This wasn't a single, organized expedition, but rather a slow, relentless push into new territories, driven by a powerful combination of necessity and an innate human desire to see what lay beyond the horizon. Think about that for a moment. The entire tapestry of human life outside Africa originates from what was likely just a few thousand individuals. Their story is written not in history books, but in the very cells of billions of people alive today. So what compelled these early ancestors to leave the continent of their origin? The driving forces were as complex and intertwined as they are today. Climate change played a starring role. Shifts in weather patterns could turn lush grasslands into arid deserts, pushing populations to follow the rains and the game animals they relied upon for survival. Resource availability was another powerful engine. As groups grew, the competition for food, water, and shelter would have intensified, making the unknown seem less risky than staying in an overburdened homeland. And we cannot discount the role of pure, unadulterated human curiosity, that spark within us that looks at a distant mountain range or a flowing river and simply has to know what's on the other side. The evidence for this great dispersal is etched into the landscape and locked within our DNA. Take Blombo's cave on the southern coast of South Africa, for instance. This incredible archaeological site provides a window into the minds of these early migrants. Here, researchers have discovered sophisticated toolkits for creating ochre paint, finely crafted bone tools, and even shells deliberately pierced to be worn as beads. Most astonishing are the pieces of ochre engraved with intricate geometric patterns. This isn't just utility, this is symbolism, this is art. It suggests a complex cognitive capacity for abstract thought and communication, a cultural toolkit that may have been just as crucial for survival as any physical adaptation when venturing into new worlds. This cultural evidence is powerfully corroborated by the revolutionary field of paleogenetics. By analyzing the minute genetic differences between populations around the world, scientists like Svante Pääbo and his team have been able to map a rough family tree for all of humanity. Their work shows that every single person of non-African descent can trace their ancestry back to that same small group that moved out of Africa around 60,000 years ago. The genetic clock, measured by the slow, steady accumulation of mutations in our DNA, allows us to not only confirm this migration but also to trace the branching routes they took along the coast of the Arabian Peninsula into India and beyond. This genetic legacy is a living archive, and it tells us that migration wasn't an anomaly in human history. It was the central event that made us who we are. It's almost overwhelming to consider the courage and resilience this required. These were people equipped with Stone Age technology, facing predators, unknown diseases, and treacherous geography. Every new valley, every new river crossing was a gamble. In that way, their story feels deeply familiar. While we may not be facing saber-toothed cats today, the fundamental human experiences of seeking a better life, of being pushed by circumstance and pulled by hope, are echoes of that ancient imperative to move. Their successful adaptation to every environment on Earth is a testament to our species' incredible ingenuity and flexibility, a trait that continues to define us. Their journey set the stage for every human encounter that followed, including the inevitable meeting with other ancient cousins who had left Africa long before. As our ancestors moved beyond the familiar landscapes of Africa and the Middle East, they entered a world that was already occupied. Eurasia was not an empty continent waiting for their arrival. It was the long-established home of other kinds of humans, most notably the Neanderthals. This was not a simple story of replacement or conquest, but one of the most fascinating and complex chapters in human history, a prolonged period of encounter, coexistence, and intermingling that left a permanent mark on our species. For thousands of years, these different human populations shared the same landscapes, hunted the same prey, and inevitably met one another. The evidence for these profound interactions is no longer just a handful of ambiguous fossils. It's written directly into the DNA of billions of people today. The stage for this incredible drama is set at sites like Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia. This remote location has utterly transformed our understanding of human prehistory. Here, archaeologists have recovered bones so small they were overlooked for decades, but within them was a genetic bombshell. DNA sequencing revealed the existence of an entirely new group of ancient humans, now known as the Denisovans. We know them almost exclusively from their genetic legacy, as very few physical remains have been found. The implications are staggering. It means that as modern humans expanded across Eurasia, they weren't just meeting Neanderthals. They were entering a world with a richer tapestry of human diversity than we ever imagined, most of which has since vanished. As renowned anthropologist Jean-Jacques Hublin has pointed out, this forces us to abandon a simple linear view of human evolution and accept a much more complex, branching story of populations mixing and separating over millennia. The most direct evidence of this mixing comes from the discovery of hybrid individuals. Genetic analysis of a small bone fragment from Denisova cave revealed a first-generation hybrid, a young girl whose mother was a Neanderthal and whose father was a Denisovan. This isn't a vague genetic contribution from thousands of years earlier. This is the direct product of intimate interaction. It proves that these groups were not separate biological species in the way we typically think. They were capable of interbreeding and having fertile offspring. These encounters were not rare, isolated incidents. Every person of non-African descent carries within them a living souvenir of these ancient meetings. Approximately 1 to 2% of their DNA originates from Neanderthals. Many populations across Asia and Oceania also carry additional DNA from Denisovans. This genetic inheritance is far from just a historical curiosity. It actively shaped our biology. Some of the most vital gifts from these ancient cousins came in the form of immune system genes. When modern humans moved into new territories, they encountered a whole new world of viruses, bacteria, and pathogens. Their immune systems, evolved in Africa, were unprepared, but by interbreeding with Neanderthals and Denisovans, whose lineages had been in Eurasia for hundreds of thousands of years, they acquired key genetic variants that were already adapted to fight off these local diseases. These borrowed immune genes provided a crucial survival advantage, a rapid way to adapt to a new environment without waiting for slow evolutionary processes. In a very real sense, we owe a part of our modern resilience to germs to our ancient Neanderthal and Denisovan ancestors. This exchange was almost certainly not purely genetic. We can also see the potential for cultural exchange in the archaeological record. For tens of thousands of years, Neanderthals had their own sophisticated tool traditions, like the Mousterian toolkit, which involved meticulously shaping a stone core to produce sharp, durable flakes. As modern humans moved into Europe, their more advanced Upper Paleolithic toolkit, which included specialized blades, bone needles for sewing fitted clothing, and importantly, microliths, tiny, standardized stone blades that could be mass-produced and hafted onto spears or arrows to create deadly composite weapons, began to appear. The question of whether this was an independent invention or the result of observing and adapting Neanderthal technologies is a subject of intense debate. What is clear is that this period saw a dramatic acceleration in technological complexity, likely fueled by the competitive and collaborative pressures of sharing a continent. Perhaps the most poignant evidence of this cultural interplay is found in the realm of art and symbolism. For a long time, the creation of cave paintings and personal adornments was considered the exclusive hallmark of modern humans. However, more recent discoveries have completely overturned that assumption. In Spain, we have evidence of Neanderthals using red ochre and shell containers for mixing pigments, possibly for body paint. Even more astonishing, deep within caves, Neanderthals created abstract engravings on walls and built mysterious ring-like structures from broken stalagmites. This suggests that the cognitive capacity for symbolic thought was not our species' unique invention. The encounters in Eurasia, therefore, may have been a meeting of minds as much as of bodies, a complex interplay of ideas, beliefs, and technologies that forever changed the trajectory of humanity, equipping us with new biological and cultural tools that would prove essential for the next, even more daring, phase of our global journey. But perhaps the most daring migration of all was yet to come, a journey into a hemisphere entirely unknown to the ancient world. Picture a landscape that doesn't exist today, a vast 1,000-mile-wide bridge of grasslands and wetlands connecting northeastern Asia to Alaska, known as Beringia. This wasn't a narrow, icy passage, but a fertile, low-lying plain, exposed for millennia as the planet's water was locked up in massive ice sheets. For generations, small bands of hunter-gatherers lived on this land, following herds of mammoth, bison, and caribou. They were unaware they were standing on a bridge between continents. Then, as the climate began to warm, corridors between the colossal ice sheets opened up, and these pioneers began to move eastward. They weren't crossing a border, they were simply following the game step by step into a brand new world. They were the first Americans, and their arrival is one of history's most thrilling and hotly debated detective stories. For much of the 20th century, one theory dominated all others: the Clovis first model. Named for distinctive, fluted spear points first discovered near Clovis, New Mexico, this theory proposed that a single, rapid migration occurred around 13,000 years ago. These hunters, with their sophisticated weaponry, were thought to have swept southward through an ice-free corridor, quickly populating the continents and hunting its megafauna to extinction. It was a clean, compelling narrative, but as is often the case in science, a single discovery can shatter a long-held consensus. That discovery was Monte Verde, a remarkably well-preserved archaeological site in southern Chile. Dated to at least 14,500 years ago, a full millennium before the Clovis culture emerged, Monte Verde proved humans were living far south of the ice sheets much earlier than anyone had believed. They lived in wooden huts, used a variety of tools, and ate a diverse diet including seafood and plants. This one site forced archaeologists to throw out the textbook and consider a much older, more complex story of how people arrived. This opened the floodgates for competing theories, the most compelling of which is the coastal migration hypothesis. Imagine these ancient mariners not as deep-sea sailors, but as incredibly skilled boaters, navigating in skin-covered vessels along the rich kelp forest highway that stretched from Asia all the way down the Pacific coast of the Americas. These kelp forests are incredibly productive ecosystems, teeming with fish, seabirds, seals, and sea otters. This theory suggests that people could have moved relatively quickly along the shoreline, hopping from one resource-rich cove to the next, even while the interior remained locked in ice. They wouldn't have needed to wait for the inland corridors to open. Their highway was already clear. Evidence for this is challenging to find, as rising sea levels since the last ice age have submerged these ancient coastal campsites under hundreds of feet of water. But occasional tantalizing clues emerge, like stone tools found offshore, hinting at a lost coastal world we are only beginning to imagine. The genetic evidence, led by pioneering researchers like Esk Willislev, has added another profound layer to this puzzle. By sequencing the ancient DNA from the oldest known skeletal remains in the Americas, scientists have been able to trace the deep ancestral roots of these first peoples. The genetic data confirms a primary origin in Siberia, but it also reveals a complex pattern. It suggests that the founding population was isolated on the Beringian land bridge for thousands of years, a period known as the Beringian Standstill, before eventually splitting into the groups that would go on to populate the entire hemisphere. This genetic bottleneck explains the incredible diversity of indigenous cultures in the Americas, all stemming from a relatively small founding population. Furthermore, some studies hint at earlier, mysterious pulses of migration whose genetic signal was later overwritten, suggesting that the peopling of the Americas may have happened in multiple waves, not just one. Once they arrived, the expansion was breathtakingly rapid. Within a mere 2,000 years, descendants of that initial founding population had pushed to the southern tip of South America, a journey of over 10,000 miles. They adapted to an astonishing array of environments: the frozen Arctic, the dense rainforests of the Amazon, the high deserts of the Andes, and the sprawling plains of North America. This rapid adaptation gave rise to an explosion of cultural diversity that would flourish in isolation for millennia, developing thousands of distinct languages, incredible artistic traditions, and vast, complex societies. They domesticated plants like maize, potatoes, and squash, fundamentally altering the landscape and laying the groundwork for powerful empires. It's almost impossible to fathom the sheer courage and resilience this journey required. These were people moving into a land of literal giants, mammoths, giant ground sloths, and saber-toothed cats. Every step was a venture into the complete unknown, with no promise of what lay ahead. What must it have been like to be among the first humans to see the geothermal wonders of Yellowstone, or to stand on the shores of the Great Lakes, or to gaze upon the snow-capped peaks of the Andes for the very first time? Their story is the ultimate testament to the human spirit of exploration, a spirit that would later drive other cultures to undertake their own incredible voyages across the world's greatest ocean. While the first Americans were mastering vast continents on the other side of the world, a different kind of migration was taking shape, one not across land bridges, but over the boundless horizon of the open ocean. This is the story of the Austronesian Expansion, a seafaring saga so audacious it makes every other ancient migration seem almost cautious by comparison. Beginning around 5,000 years ago, these maritime pioneers embarked from the island of Taiwan, and over the course of millennia achieved the impossible. They settled the most isolated islands on Earth, eventually colonizing a region stretching from Madagascar in the west to Rapa Nui, Easter Island, in the east, and from Hawaii in the north to Aotearoa, New Zealand, in the south. They didn't just cross water, they conquered it, using the ocean itself as their highway to create a domain that remains the largest culture area in the world today. Their entire civilization was built upon a single, revolutionary invention, the outrigger canoe. Think of this not as a simple boat, but as the ancient equivalent of a starship. A standard dugout canoe is unstable in rough, open waters. It can easily tip. The Austronesian solution was sheer genius. They added a floating stabilizer, a second parallel hull or a lateral float, connected to the main canoe with strong crossbeams. This created a vessel that was incredibly stable, capable of riding out large swells without capsizing. But they didn't stop there. They then mounted a massive crab-claw sail, woven from pandanus leaves, which could harness the power of the wind to propel these vessels at remarkable speeds across vast distances. These were not rafts tossed on the waves. They were sophisticated, ocean-going vehicles capable of carrying dozens of people, along with their most vital cargo, families, domesticated animals like pigs, chickens, and dogs, and the precious seedlings of staple crops like taro, yams, and breadfruit. They were essentially transporting entire sustainable ecosystems with them. This technological marvel would have been useless without another, even more profound intellectual achievement, a system of navigation so advanced it feels almost supernatural. Without compasses, maps, or any instruments, Austronesian navigators, known as wayfinders, learned to read the ocean itself. They memorized the rising and setting points of hundreds of stars, creating a mental celestial compass. They understood the patterns of swells, how large, deep ocean waves would bend around islands, creating a distinctive pattern that could be felt through the hull of the canoe, even when the island was far beyond the sight of land. They watched for specific species of birds, knowing their flight ranges would point the way to land. They observed the color of the water and the composition of clouds on the horizon, which often gather over the warm landmass of an island. This was a science developed through millennia of careful observation and passed down through generations in elaborate oral traditions. A master navigator held the entire Pacific Ocean in their mind. The archaeological evidence for this incredible journey is beautifully preserved in a distinct style of pottery known as lapita, named after a site in New Caledonia. As these people moved eastward from the Bismarck archipelago around 3,000 years ago, they left behind pottery fragments decorated with intricate, geometric designs that were stamped into the clay with delicate toothed tools. This pottery is a perfect cultural fingerprint. Wherever it appears across Vanuatu, Fiji, Tonga, and Samoa, it marks the arrival of these seafaring people. The Lapita culture represents the first human presence in the remote islands of Oceania, and they are the direct ancestors of the Polynesian peoples who would later make the epic voyages to the furthest corners of the Pacific. The spread of this pottery style provides a clear, traceable archaeological trail of one of humanity's most rapid and purposeful dispersals. This story is further confirmed by the twin fields of linguistics and genetics. The Austronesian language family is one of the largest in the world, encompassing over 1,200 languages from Malagasy in Madagascar to Maori in New Zealand. All of these languages can be traced back to a common ancestor in Taiwan, and the branching of the language tree perfectly mirrors the migratory route across the Pacific. Genetic studies of modern populations show the same pattern, revealing a clear trail of ancestry from Taiwan through island Southeast Asia and out into the Pacific. As historian Patrick Kirch has eloquently argued, this was not a random drift. It was a deliberate, voyaging corridor of exploration, trade, and colonization that connected these islands into a vast interactive network long before Europeans ever dreamed of such a world. Perhaps the most stunning example of their reach is a journey that defies all intuition: the settlement of Madagascar. Lying just off the coast of Africa, Madagascar's people speak Malagasy, an Austronesian language. Its closest linguistic relative is Maanyan, spoken over 4,000 miles away in the interior of Borneo. Around 1,500 years ago, a group of Austronesian voyagers made an incredible journey across the entire Indian Ocean. They somehow navigated the fierce currents and monsoon winds, bringing their language, their rice farming techniques, and their cultural traditions to an island already within the sphere of African Bantu-speaking communities. This single voyage stands as one of the longest, most improbable maritime migrations in human history, a breathtaking testament to their skills and daring. The Austronesian expansion was more than just a movement of people. It was a transfer of an entire way of life. They were not just explorers but horticulturalists, carrying a suite of domesticated plants and animals that would transform the ecology of every island they settled, creating new, sustainable societies in the most remote places on Earth. This profound reshaping of landscapes through introduced species demonstrates a deep understanding of their environment, setting the stage for the next great force that would drive human migration and reshape the world: the global spread of agriculture. While the ingenuity of the Austronesian voyagers was breathtaking, their entire story was ultimately set in motion by a far greater, more powerful force, one that has dictated the rhythm of human movement since the very beginning. This force is Earth's climate. It has never been a stable backdrop for human history. It is a dynamic, often volatile character in the story itself. Major climatic events didn't just influence migration, they actively orchestrated it, opening doors to new worlds while simultaneously closing others, pushing populations to the brink and offering them salvation in newly hospitable lands. To understand the true scale of ancient human movement, we must look beyond maps of continents and see the planet as our ancestors did, a world in constant, dramatic flux. The single most dramatic example of this is the last glacial maximum, a period around 26,000 to 19,000 years ago when ice sheets reached their greatest extent. Imagine a world where glaciers over a mile thick covered much of North America and Northern Europe. So much of the planet's water was frozen that global sea levels plummeted by over 400 feet. This massive drop didn't just create coastlines, it revealed entire continents worth of new land. The most famous of these revealed landscapes was Beringia, the vast, grassy plain that connected Siberia to Alaska. But this was not an icy wasteland. It was a fertile, low-lying steppe, a refrigerator for the planet that paradoxically became a verdant refuge, teeming with megafauna like mammoths, bison, and woolly rhinoceros. For centuries, human populations lived and hunted on this now vanished continent, unaware they were standing on a bridge. The Ice Age didn't just make migration possible, it built the highway itself. Then, as the world warmed, the doors began to swing shut again. The melting ice raised sea levels, flooding Beringia and cutting off the Americas from Asia, isolating the populations that had already crossed for thousands of years. But the climate doesn't only change slowly. Sometimes it shifts with terrifying speed, and one of the most startling examples is the Younger Dryas period. Right as the world was emerging from the last ice age around 12,900 years ago, something triggered a sudden, violent return to glacial conditions. In the span of a single human lifetime, perhaps even a single generation, global temperatures plummeted. Greenland ice core data shows this transition might have happened in as little as 1 to 3 years. This wasn't a gradual cooling, it was a climatic shock. For the hunter-gatherer societies that had been expanding northward into newly green territories, it was a catastrophe. Their world froze over again, plants died, animal herds migrated or went extinct, and the very resources they depended on vanished. As paleoclimatologist Lonnie Thompson has shown through his work on ice cores, these archives record the history of our atmosphere and climate, and they tell us that change can happen abruptly. The Younger Dryas was a powerful shove, forcing human populations to make a choice, move or perish. Many were pushed southward into refugia where they could survive, compressing populations and likely increasing competition and cultural exchange in these safer zones. This period of intense pressure may have been the crucible that forced the development of new survival strategies, including the early experiments with plant cultivation that would eventually lead to agriculture. The story isn't always one of cold and ice, however. In what is now the world's largest desert, there is evidence of a once green paradise. For periods during the early and mid-Holocene, from around 9,000 to 5,000 years ago, a stronger African monsoon cycle transformed the Sahara. What we know today as a vast ocean of sand was once a mosaic of grasslands, lakes, and savannas, teeming with giraffes, elephants, and hippos. Rock art in places like the Tassili Enaja Plateau in Algeria depicts this lost world vividly, showing scenes of swimming, hunting, and herding. This green Sahara, or African humid period, acted as a powerful magnet for human migration. Populations from the Nile Valley and the Maghreb moved into the heart of the continent, following the rains and the game. They were not just passing through, they settled, establishing communities around permanent lakes that have long since evaporated. When the climate began to dry again around 5,000 years ago, the Sahara slowly reverted to desert. This presented a new, insurmountable barrier, effectively dividing Africa into a northern and southern sphere and forcing the populations that had flourished within it to move once more, some back to the Nile, where they may have contributed to the rise of dynastic Egypt, and others southward, into the Sahel and West Africa, bringing their languages and pastoral traditions with them. This pattern of climate opening a door, offering a temporary haven, and then closing it again, is a repeating rhythm in human history. The same monsoon cycles that greened the Sahara also affected Asia, filling the great rivers of the Indus, Ganges and Yellow River and making intensive agriculture possible, which in turn supported massive population growth and subsequent migrations. Droughts in Central Asia may have pushed the nomadic steppe peoples to look outward, sometimes triggering waves of migration that would ripple into Europe and China. The lesson from these ancient events is profound and deeply relevant. Human migration has always been, and will always be, inextricably linked to environmental change. Our ancestors were not just actors on a static stage. They were constantly adapting to a stage that was being reshaped beneath their feet. The challenges we face today with a warming planet, rising seas, desertification, and extreme weather are modern manifestations of this ancient relationship. The same fundamental question remains: when the environment changes, whether gradually or suddenly, how do we adapt and where do we go? This deep historical perspective shows that movement is not a failure but a fundamental, successful human strategy for survival. A strategy that has not only moved people across the map, but has also mixed their genes in ways that continue to shape our biology today. For centuries, the story of human migration was written in stone and pottery, a puzzle pieced together from scattered artifacts and fading cave paintings. But what if we could read a far more intimate record, one etched not in rock, but in the very blueprint of life itself? This is the revolutionary power of genetics, a field that has given us a time machine to see the journeys of our ancestors with a clarity we never thought possible. By decoding the subtle variations in our DNA, scientists can now trace ancient human movements with astonishing precision, mapping out epic voyages that left no written history and uncovering connections that span thousands of years and thousands of miles. The key to this genetic time machine lies in understanding two special types of DNA that are passed down virtually unchanged through generations. The first is mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA, which is inherited only from our mothers. The second is the Y chromosome, passed directly from father to son. Because these two parts of our genome avoid the shuffling that happens with every generation, they act like slow-ticking clocks, accumulating tiny, random mutations at a steady rate over millennia. By comparing these mutations across different populations, geneticists can trace maternal and paternal lineages back to a common ancestor, building a vast family tree for all of humanity. These deep ancestral branches are known as haplogroups, and each one tells the story of a specific migration route. For instance, a specific mitochondrial haplogroup found in nearly all Native American populations confirms their deep ancestral link to Siberia, while a Y chromosome haplogroup prevalent across Central Asia marks the spread of Mongol Empire descendants. But the real game changer has been the ability to sequence ancient DNA, extracted from bones and teeth that are thousands of years old. This allows researchers to compare the genomes of people who actually lived in the past with those of people alive today. Geneticist David Reich, a pioneer in this field, has called this a revolution in our understanding of human history. His work and that of others has revealed that human history is not a simple tree with isolated branches, but a tangled web of interactions. We now know that modern populations are almost always the result of multiple waves of migration and mixing, a process known as admixture. The most striking example of this is the genetic legacy of the Yamnaya culture. These pastoralists from the Pontic-Caspian steppe swept into Europe around 5,000 years ago, and their genetic signature is incredibly strong in modern European populations. This single migration event likely brought the ancestral form of Indo-European languages to the continent and dramatically reshaped the genetic landscape, demonstrating how a massive movement of people can rewrite the demographic map in a surprisingly short time. These ancient journeys weren't just about people moving, they were about people adapting, As populations migrated into new environments, they faced new threats, and their DNA tells the story of this brutal evolutionary pressure. One of the most powerful examples is the evolution of genetic resistance to malaria. As groups moved into tropical regions where malaria was endemic, a deadly selection process began. A single mutation in the gene for hemoglobin, which causes sickle cell anemia when a person inherits two copies, actually provides strong resistance to malaria when a person carries just one copy. In regions where malaria was a constant threat, this protective advantage meant that individuals with the sickle cell trait were more likely to survive and pass on their genes. This is why we see a high frequency of the sickle cell gene in populations across West and Central Africa, as well as in parts of India and the Mediterranean. It's a permanent genetic scar, a testament to the life or death struggle our ancestors faced against disease during their migrations. We can see the sweeping power of migration-driven genetic change on a continental scale with the Bantu expansion in Africa. Starting around 3,000 years ago, Bantu-speaking farmers began a gradual but relentless migration from their homeland in what is now Cameroon and Nigeria, moving east and south across the African continent. They brought with them advanced ironworking technology and agricultural practices. As they moved, they interacted with and often displaced the local hunter-gatherer populations, such as the San and Pygmy peoples. The genetic evidence of this expansion is unmistakable. The Bantu languages spoken across much of sub-Saharan Africa today all trace their roots to that original homeland. More profoundly, the genetic markers carried by those original migrants are now found in hundreds of millions of people across Eastern and Southern Africa. This was not a simple cultural diffusion of ideas. It was a massive movement of people that fundamentally reshaped the genetic, linguistic, and cultural fabric of an entire continent, proving that the stories written in our genes are inextricably linked to the stories of the technologies we master and the languages we speak. Imagine a revolutionary idea, so powerful it could travel thousands of miles without a single written word, carried not by armies or diplomats, but by the slow, steady movement of families seeking new land. This was the reality of ancient cultural exchange, a process where migration acted as the ultimate delivery system for the very foundations of civilization. When people moved, they didn't just pack their belongings, they carried a priceless cargo of knowledge, beliefs, and technologies in their minds and their traditions. This silent, relentless transfer is what connected isolated pockets of humanity into a networked world, weaving together innovations that would shape the course of history. The most profound of these ideas was agriculture, and its spread from the Fertile Crescent is a perfect example of migration's power to transform entire continents. The story begins around 10,000 years ago in a region known as the Fertile Crescent, a sweeping arc of land that curves from the Persian Gulf up through modern-day Iraq, Syria, and down into Israel and Jordan. Here, groups of hunter-gatherers made a monumental discovery. They could deliberately plant the seeds of wild grasses like emmer and einkorn wheat and barley, and cultivate them. This was the Neolithic Revolution, a shift from simply taking what nature provided to actively controlling it. But this incredible knowledge didn't stay put. Over the next few millennia, it spread not as a meme on the internet, but on the feet of the farmers themselves. As populations grew, younger generations would branch out, moving into adjacent territories, taking their seed stock and animal herds with them. This was a slow wave of advance, moving at a pace of about 1 kilometer per year, gradually washing across Europe. Archaeologist Colin Renfrew powerfully framed this not just as a demographic shift, but as a mosaic of interactions, where migrating farmers would sometimes blend with local hunter-gatherers, exchanging genes and ideas, and other times established new communities that eventually absorbed or displaced the older way of life. The proof is in the pottery and the pollen. The distinct style of pottery associated with these early farmers, known as linear pottery culture, appears across Central Europe, and core samples show the dramatic clearing of forests to make way for their fields. This was more than a new diet. It was a new way of organizing time, labor, and society, and it traveled because people did. This wave of agricultural migration also carried something else incredibly powerful: language. The same farmers spreading out of Anatolia, part of the Fertile Crescent, are believed by many scholars, including Renfrew, to have been the original carriers of Proto-Indo-European, the mother tongue of hundreds of languages spoken today from Ireland to India. This theory, known as the Anatolian hypothesis, suggests that the language spread not through conquest, but through prestige and practicality. As these migrating farmers established successful, sedentary communities with a reliable food surplus, their way of life became attractive. Neighboring groups would adopt the new technology and, in doing so, likely began to use the words and terms of the innovators. This process of language shift, repeated over generations and across vast distances, could account for the incredible linguistic map we see today. It's a humbling thought that the English word for mother and the Sanskrit word matter might share a common origin because of the slow, persistent migration of Neolithic farmers thousands of years ago. Of course, migration didn't only spread foundational ideas, it also enabled the exchange of cutting-edge technology between already complex societies. A brilliant example of this is the transmission of bronze working across Eurasia. The intricate process of alloying copper with tin to create a stronger, more versatile metal was a revolutionary breakthrough, first mastered in the Near East around 5,000 years ago. This knowledge didn't spread by itself. It moved along the same routes that people did. Traders, itinerant metalworkers, and migrating craft specialists carried the secret recipes and technical skills with them. We can trace this movement archaeologically by looking at the sudden appearance of similar bronze artifact styles, molds, and furnace designs across vast distances. A dagger fashioned in Mesopotamia might have a technological cousin in a grave in Hungary, not because of trade alone, but because a skilled artisan, perhaps enticed by a local chieftain's promise of reward, made the long journey and taught his craft to a new generation. This was a transfer of pure, applied knowledge, and it accelerated the development of societies from the Atlantic to the Pacific, giving them better tools for farming, more deadly weapons for war, and more beautiful objects for ritual. Perhaps the greatest highway for this kind of cross-cultural exchange was the Silk Road, a sprawling network of routes connecting east and west. While we often picture camel caravans carrying silks and spices, the most precious cargo was intangible. The Silk Road was above all a migration route for people, merchants, monks, diplomats, and soldiers, and each of them was a vessel for ideas. Buddhist monks migrating from India carried their religious beliefs into Central Asia and China, where they merged with local Taoist traditions to create new schools of thought. Nestorian Christians migrating eastward to escape persecution established communities deep within Persia and China, bringing their unique theological perspectives. The compass, papermaking, and gunpowder technology migrated slowly westward from China, fundamentally altering the course of European history. This constant flow of people created a cosmopolitan world where a single city like Samarkand could be home to dozens of languages, religions, and artistic styles, all influencing one another. The beautiful blue and white porcelain of China was influenced by Persian cobalt and designs, a fusion of artistic tastes that met because people were willing to travel incredible distances. When we look at our modern world of instant global communication, international trade, and fusion cuisine, it's easy to see ourselves as uniquely connected. But the patterns of our globalized world are simply a high-speed version of an ancient process. The migration of people has always been the primary engine for the migration of ideas, whether it was a Neolithic family carrying a pouch of wheat seeds into a new valley or a caravan of merchants sharing stories and technologies around a desert campfire. The ingredients in your kitchen, the words in your language, and the very beliefs you might hold are likely the result of countless ancient journeys, a testament to the enduring human drive to move, to share, and to connect. And just as these physical journeys left a lasting imprint on culture, they also left a permanent record in the very structure of the languages we speak, providing us with a powerful tool to trace these ancient pathways long after the travelers themselves are gone. Think of language not just as a way to communicate, but as a living, breathing time capsule. Every word we speak, every grammatical rule we unconsciously follow, carries within it the faint echoes of ancient journeys. Languages are not static. They evolve, they branch, they mix, and they spread, almost always because people move. This makes linguistics one of the most powerful tools we have for tracing the migration routes of our ancestors, offering clues that often predate the archaeological record. By analyzing the relationships between languages and the deep-rooted words they share, linguists can map out prehistoric movements with astonishing accuracy, following the linguistic footprints left behind across continents and millennia. The foundational concept here is the language family. Just as a geneticist groups people into haplogroups, a linguist groups languages that share a common ancestor, known as a proto-language. The sheer distribution of these families paints a vivid picture of ancient population movements. Take the Afro-Asiatic family, for instance. It includes languages as diverse as ancient Egyptian, Arabic, Hebrew, and the numerous languages of the Amazigh people. Their common origin points to a prehistoric homeland likely in the northeastern corner of Africa, perhaps around the Horn of Africa. From there, the distribution of its branches tells a story of migration, westward across North Africa, northward into the Levant, and southward into the Ethiopian highlands. Similarly, the sprawling Sino-Tibetan family, which includes Mandarin, Burmese, and Tibetan, suggests an origin somewhere in northern China, with subsequent waves of migration carrying these languages south into the mountainous regions of Southeast Asia and west onto the Tibetan Plateau. The map of these language families is, in many ways, a faded map of ancient human expansion. To decode this map, linguists use a method called the comparative method. By systematically comparing core vocabulary words, those for universal concepts like mother, fire, water, and sky across related languages, they can reconstruct the sound and meaning of the original proto-language. Even more fascinating is what happens when they reconstruct words for things that aren't universal. If a reconstructed proto-language has a word for snow, but not for ocean, it strongly suggests the original homeland was in an inland, colder region. If it has a word for palm tree, but not for oak, it points toward a tropical origin. This is how linguists have used the reconstructed Proto-Austronesian language to pinpoint its origin to Taiwan. The language contained words for specific rice cultivation techniques, for the ocean, and for outrigger canoes, all of which align perfectly with the archaeological evidence of a seafaring culture that began its epic dispersal from that very island. The work of linguist Johanna Nichols has been revolutionary in adding a statistical, big-picture dimension to this field. She looked beyond just vocabulary, analyzing deep grammatical features like how a language forms plurals or where it places the verb in a sentence, across hundreds of languages worldwide. Her research revealed that certain linguistic features act like markers, spreading not necessarily because of family descent, but through long-term contact between populations along migration corridors. She proposed that certain areas, like the Pacific Rim and the Balkans, have acted as linguistic accretion zones for millennia, where languages from different families have converged and influenced each other because of repeated waves of human movement through these natural highways. Her approach provides a broader, panoramic view of how migration shapes linguistic landscapes over vast stretches of time and geography. Perhaps the most heated and enduring debate in historical linguistics revolves around the origins of the Indo-European language family. This is the family that includes English, Spanish, Hindi, Persian, and Russian, spoken by nearly half the world's population. For over 2 centuries, scholars have fiercely debated where the Proto-Indo-European speakers originally lived and what triggered their immense dispersal. The 2 main competing theories are deeply tied to migration scenarios. The Anatolian hypothesis, supported by scholars like Colin Renfrew, argues that the language spread gradually, beginning around 8,000 years ago with the expansion of Neolithic farmers out of Anatolia into Europe. In this view, the language was a passenger on the wave of a new, superior technology, agriculture. The competing step hypothesis, championed by archaeologists like David Anthony and supported by a growing body of genetic evidence, places the homeland in the Pontic-Caspian steppes of modern-day Ukraine and Russia. This theory argues that Proto-Indo-European was the language of the Yamnaya culture, a society of pastoralists who domesticated the horse and invented the wheeled cart around 5,000 years ago. This gave them a monumental mobility advantage. According to this view, a combination of climate change and new technology triggered a massive migration out of the steppes, east into Central Asia, south into the Indian subcontinent, and west into Europe. This wasn't a slow diffusion of ideas but a rapid movement of people who brought their language, their pastoral economy, and their genes, dramatically reshaping the continents. The linguistic evidence for this is found in the reconstructed Proto-Indo-European vocabulary, which contains words for horse, wheel, axle, and wool, a clear signature of a mobile, pastoral, technologically advanced society, not of sedentary farmers. This debate shows how linguistics, archaeology, and genetics are now converging to tell a more complete and complex story of our past. These ancient journeys, preserved in the very words we use today, did more than just spread vocabulary and grammar. They carried entire worldviews. When people migrated, they took with them their creation myths, their prayers, their concepts of the divine, and their rituals for birth, death, and everything in between. The dispersal of a language family often meant the dispersal of a spiritual foundation, one that would then adapt, merge, and transform in its new home, creating the rich tapestry of global religious belief we see today. These profound spiritual journeys were never one-way streets. Migrant communities faced a constant, delicate balancing act, preserving the core of their faith while adapting its expression to survive and thrive in a new cultural landscape. This process, known as syncretism, is where the most fascinating and enduring religious transformations occur. A Zoroastrian fleeing Islamic conquest in Persia and arriving on the shores of Gujarat in India around the 8th century would have held fiercely to the core tenets of their faith: the cosmic struggle between good and evil, the sacredness of the elements, and the reverence for fire. But to practice their rituals in peace, they had to adapt. They began to frame their theology in terms the local Hindu population could understand, presenting their faith as another valid path within the diverse Indian spiritual ecosystem. Their fire temples, while still housing a sacred eternal flame, often adopted architectural styles that blended with local temples. Over centuries, this small migrant community, known as the Parsis, not only survived but flourished, becoming an integral and respected part of Indian society while maintaining a distinct religious identity. Their story is a masterclass in spiritual resilience, proving that adaptation is not a betrayal of faith, but often the very key to its preservation. This pattern of adaptation was the engine behind one of the most successful religious expansions in history, the spread of Islam into Southeast Asia. Unlike its rapid spread through the Middle East and North Africa via conquest, Islam's journey into the Malay archipelago and the Indonesian islands was almost entirely peaceful, led not by armies, but by Muslim traders, scholars, and mystics migrating along the same Indian Ocean trade routes that carried spices and textiles. These migrants didn't demand radical, immediate conversion. Instead, they presented Islam in a way that resonated with the existing animist and Hindu-Buddhist worldview. Sufi mystics, in particular, were incredibly effective. Their emphasis on a personal, experiential connection with the divine, their use of music and poetry, and their tolerance for local customs mirrored aspects of the existing spiritual traditions. A village might continue to venerate a local spirit at a sacred well, but a Sufi mystic would gently reframe that spirit as a wali, a friend of God, and the well as a site of God's creation. This gradual, layered approach allowed for a deep and lasting conversion where the new faith didn't simply erase the old but integrated with it, creating a unique Southeast Asian Islamic culture that persists to this day. The historian Karen Armstrong offers a powerful lens through which to view these transformations, noting that, in the past, many of the most creative religious insights were born out of a meeting between two spiritual traditions. She argues that it is often at the borders, in the zones of contact and exchange created by migration, that religion proves most dynamic and alive. This wasn't a dilution of faith, but an enrichment. The migration of Buddhist monks from India into China along the Silk Road is a perfect example. They carried with them the sophisticated philosophies of Mahayana Buddhism, but to make it comprehensible to a Chinese audience steeped in Taoist thought, they began to use Taoist terminology to explain Buddhist concepts. The Sanskrit word dharma was sometimes translated as Tao, and nirvana as wu-wei, effortless action. This cultural translation was so successful that Buddhism didn't just take root in China, it transformed, giving rise to entirely new schools like Chan, which became Zen in Japan, a beautiful fusion of Indian meditation practices with Chinese philosophical pragmatism. The migrant monks didn't just bring a religion, they acted as catalysts for a spiritual revolution. This raises a profound question about the nature of belief itself. When we see a Catholic festival in the Philippines that incorporates ancient animist rituals for a good harvest, or a Hindu temple in Bali that venerates local mountain spirits alongside Shiva and Vishnu, what are we truly witnessing? Is it the corruption of a pure faith, or is it the ultimate testament to its resilience and humanity? The history of migration suggests the latter. The core yearning for meaning, for connection to the transcendent, is a universal human constant. But the language of that connection, the rituals, the stories, the symbols, is inevitably shaped by the culture and environment in which it is expressed. Migration forces that language to evolve, to find new words and new forms to express the same eternal truths. The spiritual maps of the world, much like the genetic and linguistic ones, are palimpsests, layered with the journeys of countless believers who carried their gods in their hearts, and in doing so, introduced them to new lands and new peoples, forever altering the spiritual landscape of our planet. This incredible ability of ideas to travel and transform not only shaped our inner worlds but also laid the groundwork for the most tangible of human endeavors, the creation of wealth, trade, and entire economic systems. But the movement of spiritual ideas was only one facet of a much larger, more tangible transformation. When people migrated, they didn't just carry their gods in their hearts, they brought their entire economic toolkit with them. This was a migration of livelihood itself, a transfer of plants, animals, technologies, and entire systems of production that could utterly reshape the landscapes they entered and rewrite the rules of wealth and power. The most profound of these economic revolutions was the spread of agriculture, and few events illustrate this better than the Bantu expansion across sub-Saharan Africa, a centuries-long migration that was essentially a slow-motion economic takeover of a continent. Starting around 3,000 years ago in the borderlands of modern-day Nigeria and Cameroon, Bantu-speaking communities began a gradual but relentless movement east and south. They were not merely wandering, they were a wave of advanced economic strategy on the move. Their key advantage was a powerful package of technologies, the knowledge of ironworking to create superior tools and weapons, and the cultivation of a suite of tropical crops, including yams, oil palms, and later, bananas. As they moved into the vast forests and savannas, they practiced slash-and-burn agriculture, clearing land for their fields and moving on when the soil was exhausted. This sustainable, mobile form of farming allowed them to populate new territories rapidly. For the indigenous hunter-gatherer communities, like the Khoisan peoples of southern Africa, the arrival of the Bantu was an economic earthquake. The newcomers' iron axes were far more efficient for clearing land, their hoes revolutionized tilling, and their reliable agricultural surplus supported larger, more sedentary populations. This wasn't necessarily a story of violent conquest, but often one of overwhelming economic displacement. The older way of life, based on foraging and hunting, simply couldn't compete with the productive efficiency of farming. Over centuries, the Bantu economic model, their languages, their agricultural practices, their metallurgy became the dominant force across most of sub-Saharan Africa, creating the foundation for the great kingdoms that would later arise, like Great Zimbabwe. This process highlights a crucial point articulated by thinkers like Jared Diamond, that geographic and historical accidents gave some societies an early head start in developing certain technologies, and the migration of those societies became the primary vector for spreading those advantages. As Diamond might argue, the unequal distribution of domesticable plants and animals around the globe created stark disparities in economic potential. Societies that developed agricultural packages early, whether in the Fertile Crescent, China, or Mesoamerica, experienced population explosions, and as their populations grew, the logical pressure to migrate to find new land for the next generation became immense. This migration then became the engine for diffusing these economic innovations, but it also set the stage for long-term global inequalities. The crops that spread from the Fertile Crescent, like wheat and barley, were highly productive and could support dense populations that developed technologies and immune systems which, centuries later, would prove devastating to the isolated populations of the Americas. Migration, in this light, wasn't just about moving people. It was about the relentless, often uneven, spread of economic power. Of course, not all economic migration was a slow, agricultural expansion. The Roman Empire provides a stunning example of how a state could harness migration as a deliberate economic tool. The Roman economy was a voracious machine, and its appetite for grain, metals, and luxury goods required a massive, mobile labor force. This was achieved through both forced and voluntary migration. Conquered peoples were often enslaved and moved vast distances to work on latifundia, large farming estates in Italy or in deadly mines in Spain. But the Romans also encouraged the voluntary migration of skilled craftsmen, merchants, and veterans to the far corners of the empire. A potter from Gaul might migrate to a booming town in Britannia, knowing his skills would be in high demand. A retired legionary from Syria might be granted a plot of land in North Africa, bringing his knowledge of irrigation to a new province. This constant state-directed movement of human capital was what integrated the vast Roman economy, creating a unified economic zone where goods, ideas, and people could flow from Scotland to the Sahara, all under the protection of the Roman legions and the common denominator of Roman coinage. This concept of connectivity brings us to the ultimate ancient network of economic migration, the Silk Road. While we remember it for the silks and spices that moved along it, its true economic genius was its role as a migration corridor for entrepreneurs. The merchants who traveled these routes were economic migrants in the purest sense, risking everything to move value from where it was common to where it was rare. A Sogdian merchant from Samarkand would spend years migrating along the routes, learning languages, building trust, and moving goods. The economic impact was transformative. Chinese silk became a status symbol in Rome, while Roman glassware was prized in Han China. But more importantly, these migrant merchants established diaspora communities in oasis towns from Dunhuang to Palmyra. These communities became nodes in a vast, decentralized economic network, facilitating not just trade but also the flow of market information, credit, and investment across continents. The Silk Road didn't just connect economies, it created the first truly intercontinental market, and it was built entirely on the backs of intrepid migrants who understood that immense wealth could be found not in a single place, but in the spaces between them, in the act of connection itself. This incredible economic power, generated and sustained by human movement, inevitably became the foundation for something even grander and more complex: the rise and fall of empires and the very structure of political power. It's a pattern as old as civilization itself. A stable, powerful state believes its borders are secure, its culture unassailable, and its political order eternal. Then, from the periphery, from the harsh and unpredictable frontier zones, comes a wave of newcomers. Sometimes they arrive as desperate refugees, other times as ruthless conquerors, but their arrival almost always acts as a political earthquake, shattering old orders and forcing the birth of new ones. The history of state formation and empire building is in many ways a history of migration. These movements of people didn't just happen in the shadow of powerful states. They were often the very catalyst that created them, destroyed them, or transformed them beyond recognition. Consider one of the most startling examples from the ancient world, the Hyksos period in Egypt. For centuries, the Egyptian kingdom of the Middle Kingdom saw itself as the pinnacle of civilization, protected by deserts and the sea. Then, around 1650 BC, a group known as the Hyksos, a name meaning rulers of foreign lands, arrived from the Levant. Traditional Egyptian histories painted them as brutal invaders, but the archaeological record tells a more nuanced story. It suggests a gradual migration of Semitic-speaking peoples from Canaan, perhaps initially welcomed as traders and mercenaries. They settled in the Nile Delta, growing in number and influence. Then, likely exploiting a period of internal weakness in Egypt, their leaders seized power, ruling the northern part of the country for a century. This was not a mindless destruction. The Hyksos introduced revolutionary new technologies to Egypt, including the horse-drawn chariot, composite bows, and advanced bronze working techniques. Their reign was a humiliation that burned in the Egyptian psyche, but it also served as a brutal lesson. When native Egyptian princes from Thebes finally expelled the Hyksos, they didn't just reclaim their land, they forged a new, militaristic and expansionist ethos, creating the mighty New Kingdom Empire. The migrant Hyksos, in being conquered, had inadvertently created a far more powerful and aggressive Egypt. This dynamic of frontier peoples ultimately overwhelming the center is a recurring theme, and perhaps no collapse is more iconic than that of the Western Roman Empire. For centuries, Rome had managed migration on its borders with a combination of military might, strategic alliances, and controlled settlement. Germanic tribes like the Goths were often invited to settle in Roman territory as foederati, or allied troops, in exchange for military service. But in the 4th and 5th centuries AD, a massive migration of peoples, most famously the Huns from the Central Asian steppes, began pushing these Germanic tribes westward, creating a domino effect of pressure on the Roman frontier. The Goths, fleeing the Huns, begged the Romans for sanctuary. Mistreated and exploited by corrupt officials, they soon revolted, and at the Battle of Adrianople in 378, they annihilated a Roman army and killed the Emperor Valens. This wasn't a single invasion, it was a systemic failure of Rome's migration policy. Wave after wave of groups, Vandals, Suebi, Alans, Angles, Saxons, and Franks crossed into the empire, not with the goal of destroying it, but to become part of it. They sought land and security. In the end, they didn't smash the empire so much as dissolve it from within, carving out their own kingdoms in its provinces. Political map of Europe was completely redrawn, and from the fragments of Roman authority and these migrant warrior cultures, the medieval kingdoms of France, England, and Spain would eventually emerge. The political scientist and anthropologist James C. Scott offers a fascinating lens for understanding this perpetual tension between states and migrants in his work on what he calls barbarians. He argues that for most of history, states and people living outside state control, often in frontier zones, existed in a symbiotic, if antagonistic, relationship. The state was a vehicle for capturing and controlling agricultural populations, but it was also fragile, vulnerable to famine, disease, and tax revolts. The barbarians on the frontier, whether nomadic pastoralists or hill tribes, were often viewed as uncivilized, but Scott turns this on its head, suggesting these peripheral societies were often deliberately avoiding the state, its taxes, its conscription, its epidemics. They were state-repelling peoples. However, they were also deeply connected to the state, trading with it, raiding it, and sometimes, when the state was weak, conquering it and starting the cycle all over again. This helps explain why so many dynasties in China were founded by steppe nomads, or why the Arab empires drew their initial military strength from the nomadic Bedouin. The frontier wasn't just an empty space, it was a political forge where alternative forms of organization were constantly being tested, and whose inhabitants held a powerful military advantage in their mobility and intimate knowledge of the periphery. No case study illustrates the world-altering political impact of migration better than the Mongol Empire of the 13th century. Beginning under Genghis Khan, the Mongols erupted from the steppes of Central Asia in a series of breathtakingly rapid migrations. Chinese letter. But to call them mindless hordes is a profound misunderstanding. Their migration was a calculated political and military strategy on a continental scale. They were masters of mobility, and their movement was their power. As they conquered, they executed one of the most dramatic talent grabs in history. They didn't just kill elites, they incorporated them. They uprooted entire communities of engineers, scribes, astronomers, and artisans from China, Persia, and Europe, and moved them across the empire to where their skills were needed. A Chinese official might find himself administering taxation in Bukhara, while a Persian doctor might be sent to serve in the court of the great Khan in Karakoram. This forced migration of expertise was a key to their administrative success. Furthermore, by securing the entire length of the Silk Road, the Pax Mongolica they enforced unleashed an unprecedented wave of voluntary migration. Diplomats, merchants, and missionaries like Marco Polo could travel safely from one end of Eurasia to the other. The political legacy of this Mongol moment was immense. It connected worlds that had been only dimly aware of each other. It accelerated the transfer of technologies like gunpowder and the printing press to Europe, and it reshaped the demographic and political landscape of Asia, laying the groundwork for future empires like the Ottoman and the Mongol. The Mongol migrations didn't just change who ruled, they changed the very rules of global politics, creating a more interconnected and volatile world. This incredible transfer of political power was made possible by an even deeper, more fundamental exchange: the migration of technology itself. While we often picture technological advancement as a series of brilliant, isolated inventions, the real story is far more dynamic. Breakthroughs rarely happened in a vacuum. They spread, evolved, and combined across vast distances, carried not by impersonal forces, but by the very footsteps of migrating people. Craftsmen seeking patronage, traders seeking profit, and scholars seeking knowledge became the unsung heroes of progress, weaving a global web of innovation that transformed every aspect of ancient life, from the battlefield to the library. Consider the chariot, a weapon that revolutionized warfare from Egypt to China. Its story begins not in a royal workshop, but on the vast grasslands of the Eurasian steppe. Around 2000 BC, nomadic pastoralists likely first domesticated the horse and developed the light-spoked wheel. This wasn't just a new vehicle, it was a terrifying new platform for warfare, combining speed, power, and archery into a single, mobile unit. But how did this technology travel from the steppes to the palaces of Thebes and Babylon? It moved with the people who knew it best. Small groups of skilled charioteers, perhaps as mercenaries or traded experts, migrated into the heart of established empires. They didn't just bring the blueprint, they brought the entire knowledge system: how to breed and train the right horses, how to construct the lightweight frames, and most importantly, how to fight from them. The Hyksos, those migrant rulers of Egypt, are famously credited with introducing the chariot to the Nile Valley, a military innovation that the Egyptians then mastered and turned against their foes. This pattern repeated itself across the ancient world, turning a tool of the nomadic periphery into the central weapon of every Bronze Age superpower, all because the experts themselves were on the move. This process of technology transfer is best understood not as a simple hand-off, but as a creative act of translation. The historian of technology Arnold Pacey described it brilliantly, arguing that technology is not just about hardware, but also involves technology practice, which includes organizational knowledge and cultural values. A migrating craftsman was therefore a translator of this entire package. A perfect example is the long, winding journey of paper-making out of China. Invented around 2,000 years ago using mulberry bark and rags, paper was a superior writing material to papyrus or parchment. But the Chinese guarded the secret closely. Its spread westward began in the 8th century, not through espionage but through migration. After the Battle of Tollas in 751, Arab forces captured several Chinese papermakers and brought them to Samarkand. These skilled migrants then established the first paper mill in the Islamic world, but they didn't simply replicate Chinese methods. They adapted the technology to local conditions, using linen and hemp instead of mulberry bark. From there, the knowledge traveled with Muslim craftsmen migrating across North Africa and into Spain. By the 12th century, paper mills were operating in Christian Europe, again often established by migrating Muslim or Jewish artisans whose skills were in high demand. At every step, the technology was not just copied, it was reinvented and improved by the migrants who carried it, adapting to new environments and new cultural needs. Beyond the flashy technologies of war and communication, the migration of humble, life-sustaining knowledge had the most profound impact of all. The ancient Near East, the cradle of civilization, was also a laboratory for water management. Sophisticated irrigation techniques like the Qanat system, underground tunnels that tapped into groundwater and transported it without evaporation, were developed in Persia. As Persian influence and people moved, so did this technology. Migrating engineers and farmers carried the knowledge of Qanat construction across North Africa and even into Spain, where it was known as Viage de Agua. This wasn't a technology that could be learned from a book. It required tacit knowledge passed down through generations of practice. The migration of these skilled diggers literally made the desert bloom, enabling the growth of cities and agriculture in arid regions and demonstrating that the most vital technologies are often those that manage the most basic human needs. Perhaps the most poignant example of intellectual migration is the translation movement of the Islamic Golden Age. Following the rise of Islam, a vast region from Spain to India was unified under caliphates that actively sought out knowledge. Greek philosophical and scientific texts by thinkers like Aristotle, Galen, and Ptolemy had been largely lost to Western Europe after the fall of Rome. But they were preserved in the Eastern Roman Empire and in Syriac Christian communities. Under the Abbasid caliphs in Baghdad, a massive project began to translate these works into Arabic. This was driven by a deliberate policy of attracting scholars, regardless of their origin or faith. Hunayn ibn Ishaq, a Nestorian Christian, migrated to Baghdad and became the greatest translator of the age, leading a team of scholars who rendered hundreds of Greek texts into Arabic. Later, as political stability shifted, these translated works, now enriched with commentary and new discoveries by Islamic scholars like al-Khwarizmi and Ibn Sina, began to migrate westward again. In places like Toledo, Spain, after its reconquest by Christian kingdoms, a new wave of migrant scholars, often Jewish and Christian translators working together, began translating these Arabic texts into Latin. This great migration of ideas, facilitated by the physical migration of scholars across continents and creeds, pulled Europe out of its intellectual stagnation and laid the groundwork for the Renaissance. It stands as a powerful testament to how the movement of people and the knowledge they carry in their minds can ignite centuries of progress, reshaping not just tools and techniques, but the very structure of society itself. Yet this infusion of new people rarely left the existing social order untouched. Instead, it often acted as a powerful solvent, subtly dissolving or dramatically shattering long-established hierarchies. Consider the Phoenicians, master seafarers from the coast of modern-day Lebanon. From around 1500 BC, they began establishing trading colonies across the Mediterranean, from Carthage in North Africa to Cadiz in Spain. These weren't just ports, they were deliberate social experiments. A Phoenician colony was typically a new foundation, a clean slate where the rigid class structures of the homeland could be reimagined. While leadership might remain with elite merchant families, the need to integrate with local populations for trade, labor, and marriage created a more fluid social environment. In Carthage, which grew to eclipse its Phoenician origins, we see a complex blend of Carthaginian elites, Libyan peasantry, and diverse immigrant artisans and soldiers, all held together by a shared commercial interest rather than a static hereditary caste system. This model, a diaspora community creating a new, hybrid social structure abroad, shows how migration doesn't just insert people into a hierarchy, it can generate entirely new forms of social organization built around networks of trade and mutual interest rather than birthright. The Viking Age offers a starkly different but equally transformative example. When Norse seafarers began raiding and then settling parts of Europe from the late 8th century onwards, they didn't just bring violence, they brought an alternative social ideal. Their society in Scandinavia was notably less hierarchical than the highly stratified feudal systems of Francia and Anglo-Saxon England. While they had kings and jarls, social mobility through martial prowess or successful trading was a real possibility. When they settled in places like the Danelaw in England or Normandy in France, this ethos clashed with the existing order. They often displaced the local Anglo-Saxon or Frankish aristocracy, installing their own leaders and creating a new, albeit still privileged, ruling class. But more subtly, their presence introduced a different concept of status, one based more on achieved wealth and military success than on inherited title. Over generations, as they assimilated, this value system blended with the local one, arguably contributing to the slow evolution of feudal relationships and helping to lay the groundwork for the more entrepreneurial and mobile social structures that would later emerge in medieval Europe. The Viking migrations didn't just change who was at the top, they subtly altered the very rules of the game. Sociologist Rogers Brubaker's work helps us make sense of these complex dynamics. He cautions against seeing ethnic groups or social classes as fixed, unchanging entities. Instead, he argues we should view them through the lens of groupness, a fluctuating sense of belonging that is constantly being negotiated, especially in contexts of migration. A migrating group doesn't arrive with a fully formed, monolithic identity that simply bumps up against another. Instead, the process of movement and settlement itself forges new identities. The act of migration can heighten a sense of shared identity among the newcomers, solidifying what might have been loose connections back home into a more cohesive diaspora in the face of a new environment. Simultaneously, it can force the host society to redefine itself, often in opposition to the newcomers. An existing social hierarchy might suddenly coalesce around a new idea of us versus them, reinforcing old class boundaries in new ways. For instance, a patrician Roman and a plebeian Roman might find a new common ground in their shared Romanness when faced with the arrival of barbarian Germanic tribes. Migration, in this view, is a catalyst that doesn't just move people, but actively manufactures and remakes the very categories of social difference. This constant negotiation between reinforcement and challenge is the central drama of migration's social impact. It can reinforce existing orders in brutal ways, as seen with the Roman practice of slavery. The massive importation of enslaved people from conquered territories across the Mediterranean was a form of forced migration that served to brutally reinforce the existing social hierarchy. The immense wealth generated by their labor flowed directly to the Roman elite, widening the gap between the senatorial class and everyone else. The very presence of a vast, disenfranchised population at the bottom of society served as a constant reminder of the power at the top, making the existing social structure seem more permanent and natural. Yet, in a paradox, this same system also contained the seeds of challenge. Over time, some freed slaves or their descendants could rise to positions of considerable influence and wealth, creating a social awkwardness that the rigid Roman class system struggled to accommodate. The Emperor Pertinax, who ruled in the 2nd century, was the son of a freed slave, a fact that would have been unthinkable in the Republic's earlier days. His rise, made possible by the migratory currents of the empire, demonstrated that even the most rigid hierarchies could be permeated, Ultimately, these ancient struggles over social placement force us to confront timeless questions about identity. When a person moves, what do they hold onto, and what must they let go of to belong? Does assimilation mean the erosion of the self, or is it a creative process that generates new, richer forms of identity? The silent testimony of graves from Viking settlements shows individuals buried with a Thor's hammer amulet around their neck and a Christian cross nearby, a personal, intimate negotiation of belonging happening at the most fundamental level. These were people caught between worlds, actively building a new social reality for themselves, one that would eventually express itself not just in who they were, but in what they built, what they created, and the art they left behind for us to discover. Perhaps the most stunning visual evidence of this cross-pollination is found not in a grand capital, but in a region straddling the ancient trade routes of northern India and Afghanistan. The art of Gandhara stands as a monumental testament to what happens when two powerful artistic traditions migrate towards each other and fuse into something entirely new. Before the conquests of Alexander the Great, Buddhist art in India was largely aniconic. The Buddha was represented by symbols like a footprint, an empty throne, or the Bodhi tree. But in the wake of Greek influence following Alexander's campaigns, something extraordinary happened. Greek artisans, or local artists trained in Hellenistic styles, began to apply their own classical ideals to Buddhist subjects. The result was a revolutionary artistic synthesis. For the first time, the Buddha was depicted in human form, and he bore the unmistakable marks of Greek sculpture. A youthful, Apollo-like face with finely chiseled features, wavy hair tied in a topknot, and a body draped in robes that fell in heavy, realistic folds reminiscent of a Roman toga. This Gandharan Buddha is a profound hybrid, his serene, transcendent expression rooted in Buddhist spirituality, yet his physical form a direct descendant of Greek aesthetic principles. This style didn't just stay put, it migrated eastward along the Silk Road with Buddhist monks and merchants, influencing the depiction of deities all the way to China and Japan, forever changing the face of Asian religious art. A similar, though distinct, fusion occurred far to the west, where the political migration of a dynasty created one of the world's most breathtaking architectural legacies. In the 8th century, the Umayyad prince Abd al-Rahman I fled the Abbasid revolution in Damascus and migrated across North Africa, finally establishing a new emirate in Al-Andalus, or Islamic Spain. He and his successors were exiles longing for the lost splendor of their Syrian homeland. This profound sense of diasporic memory is literally set in stone in the Great Mosque of Cordoba. When you step inside, you are surrounded by a forest of columns and double-tiered arches that seem to recede into infinity. The horseshoe arches are a Visigothic form, adopted and refined by the Muslim builders. The alternating red brick and white stone of the arches are a direct quotation from Roman and Byzantine architecture, which the Umayyads would have seen in Syria. This was not mere imitation, it was a deliberate act of cultural translation. The builders used the local materials and even repurposed columns from earlier Roman and Visigothic structures, but they assembled them to create a uniquely Islamic space focused on infinity and abstraction. As the art historian E. H. Gombrich might have observed, this is a powerful example of how artists hardly ever start from scratch. They work within a tradition, but when traditions migrate and collide, the most innovative new forms can emerge. The mosque's mihrab, or prayer niche, is a dazzling masterpiece of Byzantine-inspired gold mosaics created by craftsmen sent by the Christian emperor in Constantinople as a diplomatic gift to the Muslim ruler, a literal migration of artisans to create a symbol of cultural convergence. The flow of artistic influence was never one way. While we often focus on Eurasian exchanges, the African continent's impact on the art of the pre-Columbian Americas presents a fascinating and debated possibility. The Olmec civilization of ancient Mexico, known for its colossal stone heads with strikingly realistic and powerful features, has long intrigued scholars. Some, like the art historian Alexander von Wathenau, pointed to the undeniable presence of what appear to be African facial features in certain Olmec sculptures: broad noses, full lips, and sometimes even what looks like closely cropped curly hair. The famous wrestler figure and several of the massive basalt heads from San Lorenzo Tenochtitlan are often cited. The mainstream archaeological consensus maintains that the Olmecs were indigenous to the region and that these styles developed in isolation. However, the possibility of pre-Columbian transoceanic contact, however limited, remains an open question. Could a small group of West African seafarers, perhaps blown off course by currents, have made it to the Gulf of Mexico millennia ago? If so, their artistic influence, however small, would represent one of the most astonishing migrations of style in human history. Even if the influence is purely a matter of parallel artistic exploration, the very debate highlights our desire to see the entire tapestry of human creativity as interconnected, with threads that may have crossed oceans long before we ever thought possible. These artistic conversations, etched in stone and painted on walls, were ultimately about more than aesthetics. They were a fundamental language of identity, power, and belief. A Hellenistic-inspired Buddha statue made the divine accessible and familiar to a population accustomed to Greek ideals. The grandeur of the Cordoba Mosque announced the arrival of a sophisticated, cosmopolitan power in the West that could rival Baghdad and Damascus. Art became the medium through which migrant communities could assert their presence, negotiate their place in a new land, and ultimately leave a permanent mark on the cultural landscape. This creative fusion wasn't just a side effect of migration. It was one of its most enduring and beautiful gifts, a visual dialogue that continues to speak to us across the centuries, reminding us that some of humanity's greatest masterpieces were born not from purity, but from the courageous and creative embrace of the new and the foreign. And just as these travelers carried their artistic visions with them, they also brought the flavors and recipes of home, weaving their culinary heritage into the very fabric of their new lives. It's one of the most intimate parts of our identity, a daily ritual that connects us to our heritage and to each other, the food we eat. But every time we sit down to a meal, we are participating in a story far grander than any family recipe, a global story of migration, exchange, and transformation that has been simmering for thousands of years. The movement of people has always been the primary vehicle for the movement of food, carrying seeds in pouches, saplings in pots, and culinary knowledge in memory from one corner of the world to another, forever altering the landscape of our plates and the very definition of a local diet. This is the story of culinary migration, a force that turned the world into a shared kitchen long before the term fusion cuisine was ever coined. Perhaps no single event illustrates this better than the Columbian Exchange, a phrase coined by historian Alfred Crosby to describe the monumental two-way transfer of plants, animals, and diseases between the Old World and the New World following the voyages of Christopher Columbus. This was not a gentle exchange, it was a revolutionary and often devastating ecological upheaval. But from a culinary perspective, it was the greatest mixing of pantries in human history. Imagine the food landscape of Europe, Africa, and Asia before 1492. There were no tomatoes in Italy, no chocolate in Switzerland, no potatoes in Ireland, no chili peppers in India, and no pineapples anywhere but the Americas. Conversely, the Americas had no wheat, no rice, no coffee, no citrus fruits, no bananas, and no cattle, pigs, or chickens. Within a century of contact, the culinary maps of both hemispheres had been utterly redrawn. The humble potato, domesticated in the Andes, migrated to Europe and became a caloric powerhouse that fueled population booms and fed armies. The tomato journeyed from Mesoamerica to Naples and was transformed into pizza sauce. Chilies from Bolivia and Mexico spread like wildfire across Asia and Africa, becoming the fiery heart of countless regional cuisines. This wasn't just an addition of new ingredients. It was a complete recalibration of global flavor. But this process of culinary migration began millennia before Columbus. A fascinating example is the profound influence of Persian cuisine on the Indian subcontinent, a story tied to migration and conquest. When the Mughal Empire, whose rulers were of Turco-Mongol descent but deeply influenced by Persian culture, expanded into India from the 16th century onwards, they didn't just bring an army, they brought their entire courtly culture, and at its center was a sophisticated culinary tradition. The Mughals were migrants who craved the flavors of their Persianate homeland. They introduced to India a whole new philosophy of cooking, the use of nuts and dried fruits for richness, the delicate layering of spices rather than overwhelming heat, and techniques like slow cooking in a sealed pot or dum pak. Dishes that are now quintessentially Indian, like biryani, pilaf, and butter chicken's ancestor murg makhani, have their direct roots in Persian cookery. The migration of Mughal chefs and their recipes didn't replace local Indian traditions. It married with them, creating one of the world's most celebrated and complex fusion cuisines. This is a pattern we see again and again. Migrants, especially those in positions of power or prestige, act as culinary influencers, introducing new tastes that are then adopted, adapted, and reinvented by local cultures. Food historian Rachel Lawden offers a powerful framework for understanding this process. She argues that we should view cuisine not as a static, ancient tradition, but as a cuisine of the elite that trickles down and a cuisine of the people that bubbles up, all constantly reshaped by migration and trade. She writes, cuisines are not primordial, they are not natural, they are not static, they are constructed. The Italian cuisine we know today, for instance, was constructed through centuries of migration and exchange. Tomatoes and maize from the Americas, introduced by Spanish traders, were initially grown as curiosities before being embraced by the poor and eventually becoming national staples. The pasta that defines Italian food globally has debated origins, with some theories suggesting it was brought back from China by Marco Polo or introduced earlier by Arab traders to Sicily. Lawden's point is that the authentic foods we fiercely protect are almost always the result of earlier waves of globalization and migration. What was once an exotic foreign import can, over generations, become the very soul of a national cuisine. This transformative power of migrant foodways extends far beyond elite tables. Often, the most enduring culinary contributions come from those who migrated out of necessity, bringing their cuisine of the people to new shores. The enslavement and forced migration of millions of Africans to the Americas is a tragic and brutal chapter, but within it lies a story of incredible culinary resilience and creativity. Uprooted Africans brought with them a deep knowledge of rice cultivation, okra, black-eyed peas, and cooking techniques like deep fat frying. Denied their traditional ingredients, they applied their knowledge to what was available. In the American South, this led to the creation of entire culinary traditions. They transformed the unwanted cuts of meat from the plantation owner's table, like pork offal and greens, into what we now celebrate as soul food. In Brazil, African culinary influence is fundamental to national dishes like feijoada, a stew of beans and pork. This wasn't just about making do, it was an act of cultural preservation. Through food, enslaved communities maintained a connection to a homeland they could never return to, and in doing so, they gifted their new world with some of its most vibrant and defining flavors. So the next time you sprinkle black pepper on your meal, consider its journey. That pepper likely originated in the hills of Kerala, India. It was traded by Arab merchants, valued by Roman emperors, used as currency in medieval Europe, and became such a coveted commodity that it literally launched voyages of exploration that changed the world. That single spice is a capsule of global migration history. Or consider the fact that the national dish of the United Kingdom, chicken tikka masala, was invented by Bangladeshi chefs in Glasgow, adapting their traditional recipes for the British palate. It's a perfect modern example of the same ancient process. Migration leads to encounter, which leads to culinary innovation. Our globalized modern palate, where sushi is eaten in Peru and tacos are served from Seoul to Stockholm, is simply the latest chapter in a story that began when the first farmer carried a sack of seed into a new valley. This constant, delicious intermingling reminds us that our identities are not fixed, but are continually cooked and recooked in the great melting pot of history, a process that has not only changed our taste buds but has also, in ways both visible and invisible, reshaped our very biology and health. This invisible cargo of disease, carried unknowingly on the breath and in the blood of travelers, has been one of the most devastating and transformative consequences of human migration throughout history. While people moved in search of new opportunities, the pathogens they harbored often arrived first, acting as invisible shock troops that could decimate populations who had no prior exposure and thus no immunity. This process, known as the virgin soil epidemic, is perhaps most tragically illustrated by the catastrophic encounter between the Old and New Worlds. When European explorers and colonists crossed the Atlantic, they brought with them a suite of diseases that had been circulating in Eurasia and Africa for millennia: smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus. To Europeans, these were childhood diseases, grim but familiar. To the indigenous peoples of the Americas, they were apocalyptic. Their immune systems were utterly unprepared, having never encountered these specific pathogens. The results were almost unimaginable. Historians and epidemiologists estimate that within the first century after contact, up to 90% of the Native American population perished from disease. This wasn't just a tragedy of individual lives. It was a collapse of entire societies, cultures, and political structures. The city of Tenochtitlan, the magnificent Aztec capital, likely fell more to the ravages of smallpox than to Spanish steel. The disease swept through ahead of Cortez's forces, killing the Emperor Cuitlahuac and decimating the warrior class, leaving a shattered and grieving population in its wake. This demographic catastrophe fundamentally enabled European colonization, as the land appeared emptier and ripe for the taking, a stark and horrifying example of how disease, facilitated by migration, could rewrite the destiny of continents. Centuries earlier, a similar story of microbial hitchhiking had unfolded along the very trade routes that connected the world. The Black Death, which ravaged Eurasia in the 14th century, is a classic case study in how lucrative migration networks can become perfect vectors for pandemic. The plague bacterium, Yersinia pestis, was endemic among rodent populations in Central Asia, but it was the movement of people and goods along the Silk Road that gave it a global passport. As Mongol expansion and Pax Mongolica made transcontinental travel safer and more frequent, the bacterium found new hosts. It likely traveled from its steppe heartland via fleas on black rats that stowed away in grain shipments carried by Mongol supply trains. From there, it reached the bustling Crimean port of Kaffa, a Genos trading colony. According to historical accounts, the besieging Mongol forces may have even catapulted plague-infected corpses over the city walls in one of history's earliest alleged acts of biological warfare. Whether that specific tale is true or not, the Genos merchants fleeing the infected city by ship certainly carried the plague with them to Sicily, and from there it exploded across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. The very connectivity that made the Silk Road an engine of wealth and cultural exchange also made it a highway for death, demonstrating the double-edged sword of a connected world. The Black Death killed an estimated 30 to 50% of Europe's population in a few horrific years, a demographic crash that led to profound social and economic upheaval, ending serfdom in some regions and shaking the very foundations of medieval society. But this story isn't just one of helpless victims and inevitable doom. The relentless pressure of disease also drove some of the most remarkable genetic adaptations in human history, a silent evolutionary arms race recorded in our DNA. The most powerful example is the relationship between migration, agriculture, and malaria. As the Bantu-speaking peoples expanded across sub-Saharan Africa, and as other agricultural societies in the Mediterranean and Southeast Asia began clearing land for farming, they inadvertently created the perfect breeding grounds for mosquitoes standing water in irrigation ditches and cleared fields. This brought human populations into closer and more sustained contact with the malaria parasite. The result was a brutal selective pressure. In regions where malaria became endemic, individuals with certain genetic mutations gained a survival advantage. The most famous of these is the sickle cell trait. A person who inherits a single copy of the sickle cell gene from one parent has increased resistance to malaria. However, a person who inherits two copies develops sickle cell anemia, a serious and often life-threatening condition. Evolutionarily, this is a brutal trade-off, but in areas ravaged by malaria, the benefit of resistance for carriers outweighed the terrible cost for those with two copies. This is why we see a high frequency of the sickle cell gene in populations whose ancestors lived in malaria-prone zones of Africa, the Mediterranean, India, and the Middle East. It is a permanent genetic scar, a testament to the lives lost to malaria over millennia, and a direct consequence of how human migration and changes in subsistence patterns altered our relationship with the microbial world. The profound demographic impact of these disease events forces us to consider a much broader historical panorama. Author and geographer Jared Diamond placed this phenomenon at the heart of his work, most famously in Guns, Germs, and Steel. He argued that the unequal distribution of domesticable plants and animals led to societies developing in densely populated, sedentary communities in Eurasia. This density was a breeding ground for epidemic diseases, which, over millennia, forged populations with a degree of inherited immunity. When these Eurasians then migrated to other continents like the Americas and Australia, they carried these germs with them, with catastrophic effects on the indigenous peoples who had no such historical exposure. Diamond's thesis suggests that the course of conquest and colonialism was not simply a matter of technological or military superiority, but was profoundly shaped by the invisible, accidental arsenal of disease that migrants carried. These germs, in his view, were perhaps the ultimate deciding factor in the shaping of the modern world order. Furthermore, disease didn't just follow migration. It could also dictate it, actively shaping human movement patterns. The drastic population decline in European cities from repeated plague outbreaks in the late Middle Ages created labor shortages so severe that they incentivized migration. Lords and city councils offered incentives to attract peasants from the countryside or artisans from other regions to repopulate urban centers. Conversely, the fear of disease could also act as a powerful deterrent. During times of plague, travel would often grind to a halt. Quarantines were enforced at city gates and ports, and people fled urban centers for the perceived safety of the countryside, becoming refugees from an invisible enemy. The very perception of a place as unhealthy or plague-ridden could stain its reputation for centuries, diverting trade routes and migrant flows away from it. This complex dance between human movement and microbial threat shows that our history has never been a simple narrative of human ambition. It has always been a triangular relationship between us, the environments we move through, and the microscopic life that calls those environments home. And just as our journeys altered our biology and reshaped continents through disease, they also left a permanent and often heavy footprint on the very face of the Earth itself, changing landscapes in ways we are only beginning to fully comprehend. Yet this profound reshaping of our own biology through disease was only one facet of a much larger transformation, the dramatic and often permanent alteration of the very planet we moved across. For tens of thousands of years, as our ancestors traversed continents, they were never mere passengers on a pristine Earth. They were active, often unintentional, ecological engineers. Their arrival in new lands set off chain reactions of environmental change, from the sudden disappearance of giant animals to the slow, deliberate sculpting of entire landscapes to suit human needs. The story of ancient migration is, in a very real sense, also the story of the early Anthropocene, a time when humanity first began to leave a global signature on the world's ecosystems. One of the most dramatic and debated examples of this impact is the wave of megafauna extinctions that followed closely on the heels of human arrival on new continents. Picture the world of the late Pleistocene. The Americas were home to a spectacular bestiary of giants, woolly mammoths and mastodons, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths the size of cars, and beavers as large as modern bears. Australia hosted an even more bizarre menagerie, including the Diprotodon, a wombat-like creature the size of a rhinoceros, massive short-faced kangaroos, and a monitor lizard known as Megalania that reached lengths of over 20 feet. Then, relatively suddenly in geological terms, they vanished. The timing is deeply suspicious. In Australia, the megafauna disappear from the fossil record around 45,000 years ago, shortly after the first evidence of humans. In the Americas, the collapse occurs around 13,000 years ago again, right as the Clovis people and their predecessors were spreading across the hemisphere. While climate change at the end of the last ice age certainly played a role, many archaeologists and paleoecologists see the human arrival as the decisive new factor, the proverbial last straw. This overkill hypothesis suggests that these animals, having evolved for millions of years without any contact with a highly intelligent, cooperative primate predator, were simply unprepared. They possessed no innate fear of humans, making them easy prey for skilled hunters armed with sophisticated spears. Even a low level of hunting could have been enough to push slowly reproducing species over the edge. The loss of these mega herbivores would have had cascading effects on the environment itself. For instance, without mammoths to knock down trees and compact the soil, the mammoth steppe ecosystem of the north may have transformed into the waterlogged, mossy taiga we see today. The disappearance of these great ecosystem engineers fundamentally changed the very structure of these continents' ecology. Beyond hunting, the most transformative environmental impact of migration was the spread of agriculture. This was not a gentle transition but a revolutionary restructuring of the land itself. As migrating farmers moved into new territories, they brought with them a powerful toolkit for altering the environment: fire, axes, and the seeds of their preferred crops. The first and most dramatic act was often deforestation. Vast swaths of forest across Europe, Southeast Asia, and Mesoamerica were cleared using slash and burn techniques. This provided open land for fields and pasture, but it also led to significant soil erosion. Without the deep root systems of trees to hold it in place, the rich topsoil could be washed away by rains or blown away by the wind in a matter of generations. In the Mediterranean region, this ancient deforestation and subsequent erosion from overgrazing by goats and sheep left behind the rocky, degraded landscapes that are often mistakenly seen as natural today. Yet, this same pressure also spurred remarkable innovation in water management, a testament to human ingenuity in the face of environmental challenge. As historian J.R. McNeill has illustrated, human societies are in a constant dialogue with their environment, both shaping it and being shaped by it. In response to the challenges of agriculture in arid lands or on hillsides, migrating farmers developed sophisticated technologies to control water and conserve soil. The rice terraces of the Philippine Cordilleras, carved into mountainsides over 2,000 years ago, are a breathtaking example. They transformed steep, erosion-prone slopes into incredibly productive and sustainable farms, using intricate irrigation systems to control the flow of water and prevent the loss of precious soil. Similarly, in the Andes, migrating cultures built vast systems of terraces and canals to farm on steep mountain slopes, turning challenging geography into a productive landscape. These were not just farming techniques, they were profound acts of environmental engineering, passed down through generations of migrants and adapted to new lands. This ancient process of species introduction, known as ecological imperialism, often began with the most basic of human needs: food. The Austronesian expansion across the Pacific is a prime example. These intrepid voyagers didn't travel light. Their canoes were floating arks carrying a suite of transported landscapes to ensure their survival on unknown islands. This included taro, yam, and breadfruit seedlings, as well as domesticated animals like pigs, chickens, and dogs. When they settled a new island, they introduced these species, often with dramatic consequences. Rats, which stowed away on the canoes, devoured the eggs of ground nesting birds. Pigs rooted through the undergrowth, disrupting native plants. The newcomers also cleared land for their crops, directly competing with native species. On islands like Rapa Nui, Easter Island, and New Zealand, evidence suggests that this combination of human hunting and introduced species led to the extinction of dozens of species of native birds, including the moa of New Zealand, a giant flightless bird that was hunted to extinction within a few centuries of the Maori arrival. This deep history forces us to confront a complex and uncomfortable question about sustainability. We often romanticize ancient peoples as innate conservationists, living in perfect harmony with nature. But the archaeological record suggests a more nuanced reality. Some practices were undoubtedly sustainable, like the forest management of some indigenous groups in the Amazon, who enriched soils to create fertile terra preta, or the cyclical farming of the Maya, who used fallow periods to allow the forest to regenerate. Yet, other ancient societies clearly overshot their environmental limits. The classic example is again Rapa Nui, where, according to one prevailing theory, the complete deforestation of the island led to societal collapse, war, and famine long before European contact. This doesn't mean they were foolish, it means they were human, facing the universal challenge of balancing population growth with resource management in a fragile and isolated environment. Their story is not one of inherent virtue or folly. but a powerful cautionary tale about the unintended consequences of success and expansion, a lesson that resonates deeply with our own global environmental predicament today. For far too long, the grand narrative of human migration has been dominated by a singular image: the lone male pioneer, the conquering warrior, the intrepid hunter forging into the unknown. But this picture is not just incomplete, it's a profound distortion of reality. The story of our movement across the globe was written by men and women together, and by peeling back the layers of traditional archaeology, we're discovering that gender dynamics were not a side effect of migration. They were central to how it unfolded, who held power, and what cultures survived the journey. To understand these ancient movements in their full complexity, we must listen for the voices that history often tried to silence, and in doing so, uncover a far richer, more human story. One of the most powerful ways we're learning to hear those voices is through the silent testimony of the grave. Archaeology is moving beyond simply identifying a skeleton as male or female to asking revolutionary questions about their lives based on the chemistry of their bones. Isotope analysis allows scientists to read a person's geographic history from the minerals in their teeth and bones, which reflect the water and food they consumed as children. When this technique is applied to burial sites, it can reveal stunning patterns of gender-specific movement. A landmark study of corded ware culture burials in Europe, associated with the spread of Indo-European languages, found a fascinating discrepancy. The male skeletons often showed isotope signatures local to the area where they were buried. The females, however, frequently had isotopic signatures indicating they were born far away. This suggests a pattern of patriarchality where men stayed in their home territory and women moved to marry into new communities. These women were not passive trophies. They were the glue connecting distant groups, the vehicles for exchanging genes, technologies, and cultural ideas across a vast network. Their long journeys, likely undertaken for strategic marriage alliances, were a fundamental engine of cultural cohesion and expansion. This challenges the old, simplistic view of these migrations as purely masculine, militaristic conquest. It suggests a world where the movement of women was a deliberate, strategic practice that built and maintained social and political ties. Feminist anthropologist Margaret Conkey has long argued for this kind of nuanced rereading of the past, urging us to question whose knowledge is represented and whose is silenced in our interpretations. She encourages us to look for the politics of the past, to ask not just what happened, but for whom and why certain stories were prioritized. In this light, the migrating women of the corded ware culture were not just wives. They were diplomats, living bridges between clans, and crucial agents in one of the most significant linguistic and cultural transformations in human history. Their agency reshaped continents as surely as any army. We can see this agency even more vividly in the world of nomadic pastoralists. Popular imagination often casts nomadic societies as hyper-masculine, centered around male warriors and herders. But the reality of life on the move required a flexibility and shared responsibility that often gave women significant power and autonomy. In the vast steppe empires of the Scythians and later the Mongols, women were far more than caretakers of the hearth. They were essential managers of the mobile economy. While men might be away raiding or tending distant herds, women were responsible for the immense logistical task of dismantling and erecting the felt-walled yurts, managing the processing of dairy products and textiles, and overseeing the entire domestic sphere, which was the very heart of the nomadic economy. Archaeological finds of women buried with bows, arrows, and armor alongside their fine jewelry suggest that the line between male and female roles could be blurry, and that women were prepared to defend their herds and homes. This economic centrality translated into a social stature that often shocked more sedentary observers. This stands in stark contrast to the experience of women in many agricultural, state-level societies, where migration could mean something very different. For them, movement was often not a source of power but a consequence of it. In the Roman Empire, for instance, the mass enslavement of conquered peoples led to the forced migration of countless women and girls who were ripped from their homes and stripped of all agency, their lives and bodies commodified for labor and reproduction. Similarly, in other expansionist states, women might be sent as political hostages or tokens in diplomatic marriages, their fates entirely determined by male rulers. This dichotomy reveals a crucial truth. The experience of migration was deeply gendered and was shaped by the type of society one came from. For a woman in a nomadic society, mobility could be a source of authority and independence. For a woman in a conquered territory, it was often the ultimate expression of powerlessness. Yet, even in the most oppressive circumstances, women found ways to exert a profound cultural influence. They were the primary transmitters of language, folklore, and ritual within the home, the keepers of the cultural flame. An enslaved woman brought across the Mediterranean might have had no control over her body, but she could sing the lullabies of her homeland to her children, preserving a linguistic and musical tradition that could endure for generations in a foreign land. A woman who moved to a new village through marriage would bring her own recipes, weaving patterns, and medicinal knowledge, subtly altering the cultural fabric of her new community. This quiet, domestic transmission of culture is often invisible in the grand narratives of kings and battles, but it is arguably the most resilient force in human history. It's how dialects survived, how recipes traveled, and how stories outlasted empires. The most enduring migrations happened not just on horseback and in ships, but in the whispered stories told from mother to daughter around a cooking fire, ensuring that a sense of home could travel across oceans and centuries, forever anchoring identity in the face of immense change. Long after the campfires of ancient migrations had cooled to ash, their embers continued to glow in the stories people told. These were not dry historical accounts, but living, breathing myths, epic narratives passed down through generations that preserved the memory of great journeys, of leaving one world behind and forging a new one. These oral histories are far more than just fanciful tales. They are a deep cultural memory, a way of encoding traumatic, formative, and identity-forging events into the very soul of a people. They are the echoes of footsteps across millennia, and if we learn to listen to them not as fiction, but as a different kind of truth, they can provide astonishing clues to the real human movements that shaped our world. Consider one of the most influential migration myths of all time, Virgil's Aeneid. On the surface, it is the epic poem of Aeneas, a Trojan prince who flees the burning ruins of his city after the Greek victory. He embarks on a long, perilous voyage across the Mediterranean, facing storms, monsters, and the wrath of the gods, before finally fulfilling his destiny by founding the city that would become Rome. For centuries, it was read as a brilliant piece of political propaganda, written to give the fledgling Roman Empire under Augustus a glorious and ancient pedigree, connecting it to the heroic world of Homer's Greeks. But what if there's a kernel of historical truth buried within the poetry? Archaeologists have long noted that the late Bronze Age, around the time the Trojan War was said to have occurred, was a period of tremendous upheaval in the Mediterranean. The so-called Sea Peoples were raiding coastlines and toppling empires, including the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, not far from the site of ancient Troy. It is entirely plausible that the Aeneid preserves a distorted memory of a real migration of refugees from the chaotic collapse of the Bronze Age world in Anatolia. who sailed west and eventually settled in Italy, their story becoming interwoven with that of the local Latins and over centuries, evolving into the foundation legend of one of history's greatest empires. The myth, in this light, becomes a powerful cultural vessel, carrying the memory of a traumatic exile and a hard-won new beginning. This pattern of myth-preserving migration is not unique to the classical world. On the other side of the planet, the Aboriginal peoples of Australia have maintained the world's oldest continuous cultural tradition through their Dreamtime stories. These are not myths set in a distant, imaginary past, but in a sacred, eternal, everyone where ancestral beings shaped the world. Crucially, many of these stories are literally maps of migration. The songs and stories detail the paths taken by creator ancestors like the rainbow serpent or the seven sisters as they moved across the landscape, creating rivers, mountains, and waterholes through their actions. For thousands of years, these songlines have served as both a spiritual guide and a practical navigational chart, allowing people to traverse vast and difficult terrain by memorizing the sequence of events in the stories. What's astonishing is that modern scientific research is beginning to catch up with this ancient knowledge. Geological studies have confirmed that some Dreamtime stories accurately describe coastlines that were submerged by rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age, over 7,000 years ago. This suggests that these oral histories have been transmitted with incredible accuracy for millennia, preserving not just a spiritual connection to the land, but a tangible memory of a time when the geography was different, and of the journeys their ancestors took to adapt to those changes. The famed folklorist Joseph Campbell spent his life studying these common patterns in world mythology, what he called the monomyth or the hero's journey. While his work often focused on the psychological universals of these stories, they are also deeply geographical. The hero's journey is at its core a story of leaving home, undergoing trials in a foreign land, and returning transformed. Campbell argued that myths are public dreams, and dreams are private myths. In this sense, the Great Migration myths are the public dreams of a culture, working through the collective trauma and triumph of their historical displacement and resettlement. They provide a narrative structure that makes sense of the upheaval, turning a potentially chaotic and frightening history into a purposeful and destined quest. The story of the Hebrew Exodus from Egypt is a perfect example. It is the foundational story of a people escaping oppression and wandering in the wilderness for 40 years before reaching a promised land. While archaeologists debate the historical evidence for a mass exodus as described in the Bible, the power of the story is undeniable. It provided a shared identity for a dispersed people, a narrative of hope and divine guidance that sustained them through centuries of exile and diaspora. It is a myth that has given courage to countless other migrant groups throughout history, from the Pilgrims to modern refugees, because it taps into that universal archetype of seeking freedom and a homeland. The Viking sagas offer another fascinating layer to this idea. These were sprawling family histories, written down in Iceland centuries after the events they describe, but based on much older oral traditions. They are filled with tales of migration, of families feuding in Norway, packing their belongings into longships, and sailing off into the unknown North Atlantic to settle in Iceland, Greenland, and even briefly North America. The saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red contain remarkably detailed and often corroborated accounts of these journeys. They describe the sailing times, the landmarks, the wildlife, and the conflicts with the indigenous people they called the Skraelings. For a long time, these sagas were dismissed as fanciful adventure stories. Then, in the 1960s, the Norse settlement at Ellands Ox Meadows in Newfoundland was discovered, proving that the Vikings had indeed reached North America centuries before Columbus, just as the sagas had claimed. This was a stunning validation of oral history. The sagas were not perfectly accurate historical documents. They were prone to exaggeration and family bias, but at their core, they preserved a vital record of incredible migratory feats. The motivations behind them often land shortages or blood feuds, and the challenges of establishing a new life in an utterly foreign world. It makes you wonder, what stories do we carry with us today that might be the migration myths of the future? That family tale about a great-grandmother who crossed an ocean with nothing but a suitcase, or the story of how your parents met after moving to a new city for work. These are the small, personal echoes of the same grand pattern. Our family histories are often stories of movement, of courage, and of building something new. They are our personal sagas, our intimate songlines. They remind us that the impulse to move and the need to make a story out of that movement is a fundamental part of being human. We use these narratives to understand where we come from and to define who we are. And just as we now use scientific tools to test the truths within ancient myths, future generations might look back on our family stories, piecing together the larger pattern of our globalized age. The urge to find the historical truth behind these legends has driven the development of incredibly sophisticated scientific methods, allowing us to move from interpreting stories to analyzing the very earth and bones the migrants left behind. But how do we move from these powerful stories and genetic clues to solid, tangible evidence on the ground? How do we trace the footsteps of individuals who left no written records? This is where the field of archaeology steps in, armed with an ever-expanding toolkit of scientific methods that are revolutionizing our ability to track ancient human movement. It's no longer just about digging up artifacts. It's about reading the subtle chemical signatures and genetic codes locked within those artifacts, and even within the bones themselves, transforming our understanding of the past from a collection of guesses into a detailed map of ancient journeys. One of the most personal and powerful techniques in this new arsenal is isotope analysis. Think of it as a chemical passport etched into your very body. The food and water we consume as children contain specific isotopic ratios, variations of elements like strontium, oxygen, and lead, that reflect the unique geology of the region where we grew up. These isotopes are incorporated into our tooth enamel and bones, creating a permanent record of our childhood home. By drilling a microscopic sample from an ancient tooth and vaporizing it in a mass spectrometer, archaeologists can read this passport. For instance, if a skeleton is buried in England but its teeth carry the isotopic signature of the Mediterranean, we have direct evidence that this person was born far to the south and migrated north during their lifetime. This technique has been used to stunning effect, like identifying the remains of Viking raiders in Britain not as a faceless horde, but as individuals, some of whom turned out to have originated from as far away as the Baltic region. It personalizes history, allowing us to follow the life path of a single person who lived and died thousands of years ago. While isotopes tell us about an individual's origin, the artifacts they left behind speak to the movement of entire cultures. The humble piece of pottery has long been an archaeologist's best friend for a reason. Styles of decoration, clay composition, and manufacturing techniques are like cultural fingerprints. When a distinct style of pottery appears suddenly in a new region, it's a strong signal of contact, trade, or migration. The spread of bell beaker pottery across Europe is a classic example. This distinctive, upside-down, bell-shaped drinking vessel appears from Iberia to Central Europe around 4,700 years ago. For over a century, archaeologists debated whether this represented a massive migration of people or simply the spread of a fashionable new culture and its associated practices like beer drinking? It was only with the advent of ancient DNA that the answer became clear. The movement of the pots was accompanied by a significant movement of people, forever changing the genetic landscape of Britain and much of northwestern Europe. The objects were traveling with their makers not just as trade goods. The technological revolution in archaeology doesn't stop at the molecular level. It now extends to seeing entire landscapes that are invisible to the naked eye. Light detection and ranging, or LiDAR, is a remote sensing technology that uses laser pulses to map the ground surface, even through dense jungle canopy. When mounted on an airplane or drone, it can reveal the ghostly outlines of ancient cities, roads, and agricultural fields that have been swallowed by vegetation for centuries. This has been transformative in places like the jungles of Guatemala and Belize, where LiDAR surveys have revealed a Maya civilization far more vast and interconnected than previously imagined, with sprawling networks of causeways linking cities and farms, suggesting a level of coordination and movement that rewrites our understanding of this complex society. It allows us to see the highways and byways of the ancient world, the very infrastructure that facilitated migration and trade on a grand scale. Perhaps no single discovery illustrates the power of combining traditional archaeology with new technologies better than the Uluburun shipwreck. Discovered off the coast of Turkey and dating to the late 14th century BC, this ship was a time capsule from the Bronze Age world. Its excavation was a painstaking, decade-long process that recovered a staggering cargo: 10 tons of copper ingots from Cyprus, a ton of tin from Central Asia, ebony from Africa, ivory from elephant tusks, glass ingots from Mesopotamia, and amber from the Baltic. But it wasn't just the goods, it was the personal items that told the human story. The ship carried a collection of seals, jewelry, and balance weights from at least 7 different cultures, suggesting a cosmopolitan crew of Cypriots, Canaanites, and Mycenaean Greeks. As archaeologist Christian Christiansen has argued, this wreck is not an anomaly. It is proof of a highly sophisticated and globalized system of long-distance trade and migration in the Bronze Age. These were not isolated kingdoms but nodes in a vast network connected by ships like this one, whose sailors were the migrants and intermediaries of their day, braving the open sea to connect continents. All of these incredible techniques, from reading the chemistry of teeth to mapping lost cities from the air, provide us with an unprecedented amount of data. But more data doesn't always mean less debate. In fact, it often fuels it, forcing us to confront long-held assumptions and leading us into some of the most heated and fascinating controversies in modern archaeology. For all the incredible tools and evidence we have at our disposal, the story of ancient human migration is far from a settled manuscript. In fact, some of the most captivating chapters are those written in the margins, filled with question marks and heated debate. These are the controversial theories that challenge established narratives, pitting respected scholars against each other in a high-stakes intellectual battle over our very origins. These debates reveal that science is not a slow, steady march toward an inevitable truth, but a dynamic, often messy conversation. A conversation where a single new discovery can turn the entire world upside down. Perhaps no current debate is more contentious than the one surrounding the Solutrean hypothesis. The standard model, as we've discussed, holds that the first people to reach the Americas were groups from Siberia who crossed the Bering Land Bridge. The Solutrean hypothesis proposes a radically different idea, that around 20,000 years ago, during the last glacial maximum, a group of Stone Age Europeans, specifically from the Solutrean culture in what is now France and Spain, sailed across the Atlantic Ocean along the edge of the ice sheets and colonized North America. The primary evidence cited is a perceived similarity between the sophisticated, laurel leaf-shaped stone spear points made by the Solutreans in Europe and the later Clovis points found in North America. Proponents like archaeologist Dennis Stanford argue the resemblance is too close to be coincidental, suggesting a shared technological tradition. They point to archaeological sites like Cactus Hill in Virginia, which predate the Clovis culture, as potential evidence of this earlier European-derived population. The pushback against this idea has been swift, severe, and multifaceted. Genetic evidence has become the most powerful tool against the hypothesis. Extensive studies of ancient and modern DNA from Native American populations show a clear and unbroken genetic link to Asia, specifically Siberia, with no evidence of a founding population from Europe. As geneticist Jennifer Raff has pointed out, if a Solutrean migration had occurred and contributed significantly to the ancestry of the first Americans, we would expect to see their genetic signature in ancient DNA. So far, it is completely absent. Archaeologists are equally skeptical. Bruce Bradley, who initially worked with Stanford, has since stated that the technological similarities are superficial and that the methods of manufacturing the points are actually quite different. The idea of a prehistoric transatlantic voyage also faces immense practical challenges. While the ice edge would have provided resources like seals and birds for food, the journey would have been incredibly perilous in skin boats, requiring a level of seafaring for which there is no evidence in Solutrean culture. For many, the Solutrean hypothesis feels less like a scientific theory and more like a desire to insert Europeans into the foundational story of the Americas, a notion that is particularly painful and offensive to many indigenous groups who see it as an attempt to undermine their own deep historical connection to the land. A similarly fierce debate, though one fought with more nuance and less political baggage, revolves around the origins of the Indo-European languages. As we touched on earlier, this is the family that includes English, Hindi, Spanish, Russian, and hundreds of other languages. The central question is, where did it start and who spread it? The two main competing theories are fundamentally stories about different kinds of migration. The steppe hypothesis, championed by scholars like David Anthony, places the homeland on the Pontic-Caspian steppes of modern-day Ukraine and Russia around 5,000 years ago. Anthony's extensive archaeological work, detailed in his book The Horse, the Wheel, and Language, argues that the people of the Yamnaya culture domesticated the horse and invented the wheeled cart, giving them a massive mobility advantage. A combination of climate change and population growth then triggered a massive migration out of the steppes, west into Europe, east into Central Asia, and south into the Indian subcontinent. They brought their pastoral economy, their genes, and their language. Anthony points to the clear genetic evidence from ancient DNA showing a massive influx of steppe ancestry into Europe at exactly this time, correlating with the spread of corded ware and other related cultures. The reconstructed Proto-Indo-European vocabulary itself supports this, containing words for horse, wheel, wagon, and wool, the toolkit of a mobile pastoral society. Primary challenger is the Anatolian hypothesis, most associated with the late Colin Renfrew. This theory argues for a much earlier spread, beginning around 8,000 years ago in Anatolia, in modern-day Turkey. In this scenario, Proto-Indo-European was the language of the first farmers. As they developed agriculture, their population exploded, and they began a slow, steady wave of advance into Europe and beyond, bringing their new technology with them. Their linguistic dominance, according to Renfrew, came not through conquest but through prestige and demographic superiority. Their sedentary, farming way of life was simply more productive and could support larger populations, which gradually absorbed or replaced local hunter-gatherer groups. This theory uses computational linguistic models that analyze the rate of language change to argue for the earlier date. For a long time, the lack of clear genetic evidence was a major weakness for the Anatolian theory. However, the story has become more complex. Recent ancient DNA studies show that early farmers from Anatolia did indeed migrate into Europe and contributed significantly to its genetic makeup, but this happened thousands of years before the Yamnaya expansion. This suggests a more complicated picture. The first farmers may have brought an early form of Indo-European, which was then later overwhelmed or profoundly reshaped by the languages of the incoming steppe pastoralists. It might not be a simple case of either or, but a story of multiple layers of migration and linguistic influence. What's fascinating about these debates is how they exemplify the very nature of scientific progress. As archaeologist Ruth Gruen has noted, controversy is the engine of archaeology. It forces researchers to re-examine their assumptions, to seek out new evidence, and to refine their methods. The bitter arguments over the Solutrean hypothesis have driven geneticists to sequence more ancient American DNA than ever before, ultimately providing an even more robust and detailed picture of the Siberian origins of the first peoples. The Indo-European debate has spurred incredible interdisciplinary collaboration between archaeologists, linguists, and geneticists, each field providing a piece of the puzzle. These controversies also capture the public imagination in a way that settled science rarely does. They tap into our deep curiosity about who we are and where we come from, and they remind us that history is not a dull list of facts, but a living, breathing detective story with real stakes. This inevitably leads us to a deeper, more philosophical question. What is historical truth? Is it the story that has the most evidence behind it today? Or is it a story that is constantly being rewritten with every new discovery? The debates show us that truth is provisional. The consensus can and does change. A theory that seems outlandish today might gain traction with a single new find, while a long-held belief can be overturned by a DNA test on a single skeleton. This uncertainty can be uncomfortable, but it is also the source of science's greatest strength, its capacity for self-correction. It forces us to be humble, to acknowledge that our understanding of the past is always a work in progress, a best fit model based on the fragments we have managed to recover. And as we grapple with these profound questions of origins and identity, we must also confront the very real and often painful ethical implications of this research, and who has the right to tell the stories these bones and genes reveal. But as we use these powerful new tools to uncover our shared past, we must also pause and ask a much deeper question. Just because we can study ancient migrations, does that always mean we should? The quest for knowledge, however noble, does not exist in a vacuum. It is intertwined with profound ethical dilemmas, historical trauma, and the very real political battles of the present day. For decades, the field of archaeology and genetics operated under a simple, if arrogant, assumption that ancient skeletons and artifacts were the shared inheritance of all humanity, there for scientists to study as they saw fit. But a powerful and necessary reckoning has been underway, forcing researchers to confront the uncomfortable truth that the bones they study are not merely specimens, they are someone's ancestors, and their stories are not ours to tell without permission. One of the most explosive examples of this ethical clash is the 2-decade-long saga of the Kennewick Man. In 1996, the nearly 9,000-year-old skeleton was discovered on the banks of the Columbia River in Washington state. Scientists were electrified. His cranial features appeared different from those of modern Native American populations, leading to sensational and widely publicized theories that he might represent an earlier, different migration into the Americas, unrelated to contemporary tribes. This immediately triggered a bitter legal battle. A coalition of 5 Native American tribes, citing the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA, demanded the right to rebury what they called the Ancient One, whom they believed to be their direct ancestor. The scientists, fearing the loss of priceless data, sued to block the repatriation. For 20 years, the skeleton became a pawn in a painful struggle between scientific curiosity and cultural sovereignty. The tribes argued that their oral histories, which spoke of their presence in the land since time immemorial, were being dismissed in favor of speculative and often disrespectful scientific theories. The case became a symbol of a much larger issue. The long history of scientists treating indigenous remains as objects of study rather than as human beings with living descendants who held a sacred duty to care for them. The eventual resolution came only after advanced genetic testing in 2015 proved what the tribes had said all along. Kennewick man was indeed most closely related to modern Native Americans, particularly the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation. He was finally reburied with ceremony in 217. This painful episode serves as a stark lesson that science must be conducted not just with rigor, but with humility and respect for the communities whose history is being written. This new, more ethical approach is powerfully championed by scholars like Kim Tallbear, a professor and citizen of the Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate. Tallbear's work critically examines the intersection of genetic science and indigenous identity. She challenges the very notion that DNA can be a simple, objective arbiter of who is a real Indian, pointing out how this can be used to undermine tribal sovereignty, which is based on political citizenship and cultural connection, not genetic percentages. She argues for a model of standing with rather than studying down at. This means scientists must move beyond simply extracting data from indigenous communities and instead engage in true collaboration from the very beginning of a research project. This includes asking for free, prior, and informed consent, ensuring the research questions are actually relevant to the community, sharing all results and benefits, and accepting that some knowledge may be considered too sacred to be published for the world to see. It's about shifting the power dynamic, recognizing that communities are the rightful stewards of their own history, and that scientists are guests, not owners of that story. This ethical imperative extends beyond the lab and into the booming commercial world of genetic ancestry testing. Companies promise to reveal your deep ancestral origins with a simple cheek swab, but these tests often traffic in profound oversimplifications. They compare your DNA to modern reference populations, creating a neat percentage-based map of your ancestry that can be deeply misleading. For someone with colonial ancestry, it might be a fun parlor game to discover they are 10% Scandinavian. But for indigenous peoples whose identities are already constantly questioned and policed by colonial governments, these tests can be weaponized. A person whose family was torn apart by forced assimilation policies might be told they are not native enough based on a commercial DNA test that uses flawed or incomplete reference data. These tests reduce complex, culturally rich identities to a biological essence, often erasing the very real political and historical contexts that shaped them. They can create a false sense of connection to a romanticized past while undermining the lived experiences and sovereign rights of present-day communities. The political misuse of migration narratives is perhaps the most dangerous ethical frontier. The story of human prehistory has never been just about the past. It is always used to justify power in the present. The idea of pure indigenous populations or ancient Aryan migrations has been a favorite tool of white supremacists and nationalists for over a century. They selectively twist genetic studies to argue for the primordial ownership of land by one group and the exclusion of others. We see this today in the rise of ethno-nationalism across the globe, where distorted versions of history are deployed to fuel hatred against immigrants and minorities. When a study is published showing a significant migration into Europe thousands of years ago, it is instantly seized upon by all sides of the political spectrum. Some might use it to argue that Europe has always been a continent of migrants, and thus modern immigration is nothing new. Others might distort the same data to claim that a specific type of people are the true founders of European civilization. This places a heavy responsibility on scientists to communicate their findings with extreme care, to actively combat misinterpretations, and to constantly emphasize that our ancient past was a story of endless mixing, movement, and shared ancestry, not one of pure, isolated tribes. The science of human migration, perhaps more than any other field, forces us to realize that the stories we tell about the past are never neutral. They are powerful forces that shape our laws, our borders, and our very sense of who belongs. And as we look to the future of this research, it becomes clear that the greatest discoveries will not just be made in the laboratory, but in the building of respectful, equitable partnerships that honor the deep and enduring connections between the past and the present. Yet this potent connection between our deep past and our present identity is a double-edged sword, one that is being wielded with increasing force in the heated political arenas of the 21st century. The very same genetic studies that reveal our interconnectedness are often cherry-picked and distorted to serve a very different agenda, that of ethnic nationalism and exclusion. In recent years, certain far-right and white nationalist movements have co-opted the language of science, particularly population genetics, to argue for a mythic past of pure European populations. They point to studies about the Yamnaya migrations or the genetic makeup of ancient skeletons to invent a narrative of primordial white identity, using these slivers of data to justify modern policies of immigration restriction and racial purity. This is a profound and dangerous misreading of the science. As we have seen, the entire story of human prehistory is one of endless mixing, migration, and admixture. There is no pure population. Every modern nation is built upon layers of ancient movement. The geneticist David Reich has been vocal about this, stating that while we can see differences between populations, the fact that such differences exist does not make them fundamental. The picture of a pure population is a fiction, yet this fiction remains incredibly powerful because it taps into a deep human need for belonging and a simple origin story. This process of building national identity around a selective reading of history is what the political scientist Benedict Anderson famously termed imagined communities. Anderson argued that nations are not ancient, natural formations but are socially constructed. They are imagined because most members of a nation will never know most of their fellow members, yet in the minds of each lives the image of their communion. A crucial tool for building this sense of communion is the crafting of a shared, often mythologized history. For many modern nations, this foundational myth involves a specific story of migration and origin. The United States long imagined itself as a nation of immigrants, though this narrative often conveniently excluded the forced migration of enslaved Africans and the prior presence of Native Americans. In contrast, many European nations have built identities around a myth of autochthony, the idea that their people have sprung from the soil itself and have been there since time immemorial. The discovery through genetics and archaeology that their countries were, in fact, shaped by multiple waves of migration from Neolithic farmers to steppe pastoralists directly challenges these nationalist myths, creating a tension between scientific truth and political identity. In a powerful counter-narrative, many indigenous communities are actively reclaiming their own migration stories to assert sovereignty and cultural resilience. For centuries, colonial powers often used the concept of indigenous migration to undermine land rights, arguing that if Native Americans had themselves migrated across Beringia, then they were no more native than the European settlers. Today, many tribes are flipping this script. Rather than denying their deep journeys, they are embracing them as a core part of their sacred histories. Their oral traditions, which speak of emerging from the earth or of long journeys guided by spiritual beings, are now being seen as complementary to, not in conflict with, scientific evidence. This reclamation is an act of empowerment. It asserts that their presence on the land is not a recent accident, but the result of a purposeful, ancient journey ordained by their creators, granting them a deep, unbreakable connection to their territories that far predates the arrival of nation-states. This isn't about claiming genetic purity. It's about affirming a continuous cultural and spiritual relationship with the landscape that has been maintained for thousands of years, a powerful argument for sovereignty and environmental stewardship in the present. These battles over the past are not academic. They have real-world consequences for policy, law, and human lives. Immigration debates across Europe and North America are frequently saturated with rhetoric about protecting a national culture and identity that is presented as static and ancient. Understanding that these identities are themselves the product of constant migration and change completely reframes the argument. It reveals that the desire to close borders to protect a pure heritage is based on a historical fallacy. The very cultures that nativists seek to protect were forged by the same processes of movement, exchange, and adaptation that they now fear. This historical perspective doesn't argue for open borders without limit, but it does insist that the conversation must be based on realistic economic, social, and humanitarian considerations, rather than on a false and dangerous mythology about a pristine, unchanging past. It asks us to see migration not as a threat to identity, but as the very force that has created and continually reinvented our identities for millennia. So where does this leave us as individuals navigating a world where our very genes can be used as political weapons or tools of unity? It asks us to develop a new literacy, one that allows us to appreciate the scientific stories of our ancestry without reducing our complex identities to a simple DNA percentage. It invites us to hold a more nuanced view of history, one that embraces the complexity, mixing, and movement that define the human story. The next time we hear a story about ancient migrations, whether in a news headline or a political speech, we must ask ourselves, is this being used to build walls or to build bridges? Is it acknowledging our shared journey, or is it trying to carve out a separate, exclusive destiny? The answers to these questions will determine not just how we understand the past, but how we shape our future, a future that will undoubtedly be written by the next great chapter in the human story of movement. Imagine a world where we don't just map the migration routes of entire cultures, but can track the life journey of a single individual who lived 10,000 years ago, where we can pinpoint the village they were born in, the path they traveled, and even what they ate for lunch on a specific day. This isn't science fiction, it's the breathtaking frontier of migration studies, a field undergoing a revolution so profound it's rewriting entire chapters of human history in real time. The tools that brought us this far, ancient DNA, isotope analysis, and LIDAR are now being supercharged by a new wave of technologies and a radical spirit of interdisciplinary collaboration, pushing our understanding to resolutions we never dreamed possible. At the heart of this revolution is paleogenomics, the study of ancient DNA, which is evolving at a breakneck pace. The challenge is no longer just getting DNA from well-preserved skeletons in cold environments. It's about extracting genetic material from sources once considered impossible. Scientists are now sequencing DNA from cave dirt from the microscopic skin cells and hair follicles our ancestors shed thousands of years ago. They're pulling it from ancient chewing gum, like a piece of birch pitch from Scandinavia, chewed by a young woman 5,700 years ago, which revealed her entire genome, her oral microbiome, and even the duck and hazelnuts she'd last eaten. This ability to access DNA without bones is a game changer, allowing us to peer into regions and time periods where preservation is poor, and to study populations that practiced cremation, leaving no skeletal remains behind at all. To make sense of this avalanche of new genetic data, researchers are turning to sophisticated computational modeling and artificial intelligence. We're moving beyond simple family trees to complex statistical models that can simulate thousands of different migration scenarios, testing them against the genetic evidence to see which ones fit best. Projects like the Allen Ancient DNA Resource, a massive open-access database curated by researchers like David Reich, are the bedrock of this work. This resource aggregates genetic data from thousands of ancient individuals, allowing scientists anywhere in the world to run comparisons and spot large-scale patterns that would be invisible in a smaller sample. As population geneticist Pontus Skoglund has speculated, the future lies in integrating this genetic data with archaeological, linguistic, and climatic models. He envisions a holistic model where we can input the climate data for a specific millennium and see how shifting rainfall patterns might have forced a population to move, and then find the genetic and archaeological evidence to confirm that movement happened. This isn't just connecting dots, it's weaving together the entire fabric of human history. This collaborative spirit is shattering the old silos between academic fields. The most exciting discoveries are now happening at the intersections, in the spaces where geneticists, archaeologists, linguists, and climatologists are all working together in the same room, literally and virtually. An archaeologist's discovery of a unique pottery style in a dig site can now be immediately cross-referenced with a geneticist's analysis of the bones found in that same layer, while a linguist examines the potential spread of a word for that type of pot. It's a constant, thrilling conversation where each discipline provides a piece of the puzzle, validating or challenging each other's theories and leading to a much more robust and nuanced understanding. With these powerful new tools in hand, scientists are setting their sights on some of the biggest unanswered questions in human prehistory. The precise route and timing of the first human arrival in Australia, for instance, remains hotly debated. Did they island hop across a chain of now submerged landmasses in Southeast Asia, or were they skilled enough sailors to make longer, open water voyages? The answers lie on the seafloor, submerged under hundreds of feet of water since the end of the last ice age. But new underwater archaeology techniques and detailed mapping of ancient coastlines are beginning to reveal these lost worlds. Perhaps the most tantalizing mystery is the potential for pre-Columbian contact between the peoples of Oceania and South America. We know that the sweet potato, a crop domesticated in the Andes, was present in Polynesia centuries before European contact. How did it get there? Did Polynesian voyagers, the greatest navigators the world has ever seen, actually reach the Americas and return? Or did a single storm-blown canoe make an accidental one-way journey? The genetic evidence is still elusive, but researchers are now comparing ancient DNA from chicken bones in Chile with that of ancient Polynesian chickens, and analyzing the genomes of modern populations on both sides of the Pacific for any faint signal of that ancient encounter. Solving this mystery would fundamentally alter our understanding of the pre-modern world as a place of isolated hemispheres, revealing it instead to be a place of astonishing, long-distance connections. The future of migration studies is not just about answering old questions, but about discovering entire lost chapters of the human story that we never even knew to ask about. It's about finding the ghosts in our genes, the whispers of journeys taken and forgotten, and slowly, painstakingly, reassembling the most epic story of all: how we, a species born in one small corner of Africa, came to inhabit, shape, and connect every single continent on Earth. So as we reach the end of this incredible journey, tracing the footsteps of our ancestors from the African savanna to the farthest islands of the Pacific, a single, overwhelming truth comes into focus. We are not just products of a place, but of a journey, a continuous, dynamic process of movement, encounter, and adaptation that has been the central engine of human history. The evidence is all around us, and more importantly, it is within us. It's in the 2% of Neanderthal DNA that might be boosting your immune system today. It's in the words you speak, which likely originated far from the land you call home. It's in the food you eat, a delicious testament to thousands of years of culinary exchange. From the legal systems that govern us to the religious beliefs that comfort us, from the technologies that connect us to the very structure of our societies, the legacy of ancient migration is the invisible architecture of our modern world. Understanding this deep, interconnected past is no longer just an academic exercise. It is an urgent necessity. We live in an era of renewed mass movement, where climate change, conflict, and economic disparity are pushing people to migrate in search of safety and opportunity. The political debates surrounding these movements are often fraught with fear and talk of preserving static, pure cultures. But as we've seen, this idea is a historical fantasy. There is no us and them in the long view of history. There is only an endless, complex web of we. Our ancestors were all migrants, and their success was not measured by their ability to build walls, but by their capacity to adapt, to learn from new neighbors, and to blend the old ways with the new to create something stronger. The challenges of cultural integration and climate migration that we face today are not unprecedented crises. They are the latest chapter in the oldest human story. By looking back, we can find a roadmap for the future, one built not on fear of change, but on the proven human genius for creating community out of movement and strength out of diversity. This brings us to a final, empowering thought. The story of human migration is not a tale of vast, impersonal forces dictating our fate. It is a story of countless individual choices, acts of incredible courage, and the resilience of ordinary people. It was made by families packing their most precious seeds into a canoe, by traders learning a new language to close a deal, by artisans sharing a revolutionary technique with a stranger. This is why the words of the great anthropologist Margaret Mead ring so true across the centuries. She reminded us that, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Our history proves her right. The world was not shaped by faceless hordes, but by small bands of pioneers, by committed groups of explorers, by communities who chose to build bridges instead of barriers. That power, the power to shape the future through thoughtful action and a commitment to one another, is the greatest inheritance our migratory past has given us. Now we want to hear from you. As you reflect on everything we've explored together, what resonates most? Do you have a family story of migration, whether from 500 years ago or 2 generations ago? How do you see these ancient patterns influencing your own identity, your food, your traditions, or the language you speak? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments below. Let's continue this conversation and learn from each other. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the mysteries of our shared past, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss our next adventure into the incredible stories that shaped our world. Thank you for watching.